Karen Gregory was born on March 29, 1948, in Albany, New York. She was the eldest of 4 children and helped her parents take care of her siblings from a young age. The girl was into sports and spent a lot of time in nature. Additionally, she loved art and wanted to work in that field. After finishing high school, Karen enrolled in Nazareth College in Rochester, where she received a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Science degrees. After that, she worked as an art teacher in an elementary school for several years and then decided to become a graphic designer. In 1983, when she was 35 years old, she moved to Florida, where she met a man named David McKee. He worked as a manager in an organization that provided consulting services to Vietnam veterans, and he and Karen quickly became mutually attracted. The couple dated for just over a year, and in the spring of 1984, David asked her to move in with him in Gulfport. Before this, Karen lived in an apartment with her friend, and she constantly had to drive to David's house. The woman accepted this offer and began gradually moving her things there. On May 22nd, Karen took the remaining items from her apartment and finally moved out completely. She told her neighbor that she was a little nervous. David had gone to another state for work to speak at a conference, and she would have to spend a whole week alone in his house. From the apartment, the woman went to her friend's house. They had a great time there. Karen told her friend that she was very happy with David and was glad she would finally be living with him. The friends talked until about midnight, after which Karen went to David's house. The next day, he called home several times, but no one answered. He thought Karen might have stayed in her old apartment and called her neighbor, but the woman said she hadn't seen her since yesterday. After that, David called several of Karen's friends and her sister, but none of them had seen her. He continued to try to reach her all day, but he never got an answer. On the next day, May 24th, David called home again early in the morning, hoping to catch Karen before she left for work, but there was still no answer. Later, he called her boss and found out that she had not shown up for work. At this point, David's concern reached its peak, and he feared that something bad may have happened to Karen. He then called local hospitals and police stations to inquire if they had seen anyone matching Karen's description. Upon learning that they had not, he decided to call his neighbor, Amy. David asked her, "Is Karen's car parked in front of the house?" Amy looked out the window and replied, "Yes." This only added to David's worry. He asked Amy to go to the house and knock on the door. He was so anxious that he stayed on the line with her until she left to fulfill his request. Amy approached the side door and knocked, but there was no answer. She then walked around the house and saw that one of the windows was open. She called out Karen's name several times, but there was no response. She extended her arm through the open window, pulled back the curtain, and was shocked by what she saw. The window was in the bedroom, and through it, she could see the hallway where a bloodied female body lay on the floor. Amy couldn't see the face because she was behind a wall, but she knew it was likely Karen. After recovering from the shock, Amy ran back to her own house where David was still on the phone. She grabbed the phone and told him that something terrible had happened before hanging up and calling 911. Doctors quickly arrived at the scene, but were only able to confirm Karen's death. Detectives began investigating the crime scene, which horrified even experienced police officers. Based on the amount of blood throughout the house, Karen had fought her attacker until the end. Bloodstains led from the hallway to the front door, where several fragments of glass had been smashed. Detectives noticed several strands of hair, matching Karen's hair color, stuck in the broken glass. They theorized that she had almost made it outside, but was caught by her attacker. In the bathroom, investigators found their first lead, a bloody footprint on the floor. Police checked Karen's feet and found no bloodstains, so the footprint must have belonged to her killer. However, it was unclear why the killer was walking around barefoot in the bathroom. Medical experts examined the victim's body and concluded that she had received about 20 stab wounds and had been subjected to violence. Experts also extracted biological material from the perpetrator. Unfortunately, DNA analysis was not used in 1984, so this clue could not help to identify the killer. In addition, several bloody fingerprints were found on her body, but they were too smeared to be used. According to experts, the woman was killed about 30 hours before she was discovered. This meant that she was attacked on the same night when she returned home from her friend's place. There was another detail that immediately caught the attention of the police and doctors as soon as they saw Karen's body. She was wearing a shirt, and a lace corset was on top of it. Apparently, the perpetrator did this. When the police finished examining the crime scene and collected all possible clues, they allowed Karen's friends to start cleaning up. The women did not want David to see all this horror when he arrived. All the victim's acquaintances knew how much he loved her and wanted to ease his suffering at least a little. David's conference was taking place on the other side of the country, so he needed a lot of time to return home. Meanwhile, the detectives began questioning the neighbors. This area was considered quite prestigious and safe, and the crime rate was extremely low. Many residents knew each other, and they even had a neighborhood watch. This is a form of agreement between neighbors when they keep an eye on order and report any suspicious things to the police. However, in this case, the neighborhood watch did not perform its functions. Detectives found out that on May 23rd, at around 1:15 a.m., 16 residents of the area heard a piercing female scream, and none of them called the police. They all said the scream quickly stopped, and they did not get the impression that someone could be in danger. Even the head of the neighborhood watch, who lived practically opposite the victim, did not consider it necessary to call the police. He was fixing his motorcycle in the garage and listening to the radio when he heard a muffled scream. The man went out of the garage, walked down the street, and did not notice anything suspicious, after which he returned back. A neighbor who lived opposite David shared an interesting observation. On the morning of May 23rd, she saw that the front door of his house was open, and she also heard a scream that night, but did not associate it with the open door. In her story, there was one detail. When the police arrived on the call, the door was locked. Considering that the body had been in the house for about 30 hours, the culprit could have returned and tried to cover his tracks, including closing the door. It was noteworthy that there were no signs of forced entry on any of the doors. Detectives speculated that the perpetrator may have climbed in through the back window, but there were also no signs of forced entry there. Either Karen left it open all night, or she knew the killer and let him in herself. The head of the neighborhood watch shared another interesting observation with the detectives. On the evening of the day after Karen's murder, an unknown man pulled up to her house. He got out of the car, knocked on the door a few times, and kept looking around. Then he returned to the car, but a few minutes later, he came back with a piece of paper in his hand. He placed it on Karen's car windshield and only then drove away. The police immediately checked the car and indeed found a note on the windshield that said, "Karen and David, hi, I stopped by around 7:15 p.m. but didn't see any signs of life. I have a lot to do tonight, so I probably won't be back, but I have what you asked for." The detectives immediately noticed the wording, "No signs of life." Given that at the time this person arrived, Karen had been dead for almost a whole day, such a choice of words was very alarming. The note ended with the name Peter, and investigators tried to find him. It turned out that he had been right under their noses the whole time. Soon after the discovery of the body, the man learned about it from Karen's former neighbor and came to their house. The man cooperated actively and answered all the questions. He voluntarily provided his fingerprints and footprints and also told them what he was doing near the victim's house. According to Peter, a few days before this, Karen called him and invited him and David to dinner. But there was one detail. Karen supposedly told him that David would also be there, even though at the time he was already scheduled to go on a week-long business trip. The detectives also asked Peter what he meant in the note by the phrase, "I have what you asked for." The man said he borrowed a cassette from them and was planning to return it. Another strange detail was that Peter allegedly did not notice the glass shards almost all over the path to the front door, let alone the several broken windows. The man insisted that he hadn't seen anything or paid attention to it. During the conversation with him, one of the detectives noticed a large cut on Peter's hand. When the police officer looked at his hand, the man covered the spot and said that he always gets scratches after playing with dogs or repairing his car. All of the above looked extremely suspicious, and the detectives decided to check his alibi. Peter said that on the night of the murder, he was sleeping at home, and his neighbor confirmed this. The police didn't rush to exclude him from the list of suspects, since such an alibi could easily be a lie. However, the investigators quickly came up with another suspect, David, Karen's boyfriend. According to his words, that night he was in Rhode Island, which is located 2,000 kilometers away from his home, and he was sleeping in his hotel room. But at the crime scene, the police found a very interesting clue. A local Rhode Island newspaper dated May 23rd, the same day Karen was killed. It was very strange, and the detectives began to wonder if David could have flown to Florida, killed his girlfriend, and returned before his next conference appearance. They calculated the flight and travel times from airports and concluded that it was indeed possible. Additionally, no one could confirm David's alibi for that night since he had allegedly slept alone in his hotel room. The head of the neighborhood watch also shared his observations. He had repeatedly noticed that Karen and David argued when the woman came to his house. David, on the other hand, insisted that they had a wonderful relationship and the couple hardly ever fought. When David was asked about the newspaper, he said he bought it on May 21st at a store near his home. He was going to take it with him on the trip to have the weather forecast for the week. Investigators went to that store, and the clerk confirmed that they sold that newspaper. He even remembered that David bought it on the 21st. According to the clerk, the publication actually released that issue several days ago, which is normal for printed newspapers. Thus, suspicions against David faded into the background. They asked him if anything was missing from her house, and the man noticed the absence of a white lace corset that Karen had bought for herself a few months earlier, one very similar to the one worn by Karen's killer. This immediately led the detectives to think that the depraved criminal had taken it as a trophy. The police decided to pursue another lead found in the victim's house, a high-quality drawing of a watch signed with the name Stephen Fischler. One particular detail caught the detectives' attention. The paper appeared to be covered in blood. The detectives quickly discovered that Stephen worked with Karen in the same company and questioned her colleagues. They uncovered a lot of interesting information. Almost all the employees said that Stephen was a rather strange person. He persistently tried to court all the female colleagues, shared pictures with them depicting perverted things, and even wrote a perverted poem and tried to persuade his colleagues to read it. All the women who worked with him admitted that Stephen scared them. Karen also complained several times about his behavior, but management didn't give it much thought. The detectives talked to him, and the man denied giving Karen that drawing. He also claimed that he barely knew the victim and offered to take a polygraph test to prove his innocence. The investigators quickly organized such a test, and that's where the most interesting part began. At first, everything was calm, but after one of the questions, Stephen suddenly said that he killed Karen. Literally, a few seconds later, he took his words back and said that he had nothing to do with it. What was strange was that in both cases, the polygraph operator did not detect a lie. This confused the detectives, but they couldn't rely on the polygraph results. This instrument is far from perfect and simply cannot accurately determine whether a person is lying or not. At the same time, they understood that Stephen was clearly a very strange person and could say anything. Soon, experts studied his drawing and concluded that the red stain on it was left by ketchup, not blood. As a result, they began to doubt whether Stephen was involved in Karen's murder. Despite such a number of suspects, the police still couldn't gather enough evidence against anyone, and the case remained unsolved for several months. Detectives continued to investigate, but they couldn't find any new leads. This continued until December, when something interesting happened. One of the respected residents of Gulfport was retiring, and in honor of this event, local residents organized special events. Many people attended, including a woman named Mary, who struck up a conversation with a police officer who was also present. During their conversation, they discussed the murder of Karen Gregory, and Mary inadvertently mentioned that she too had heard her piercing scream that night. The officer immediately noted one strange detail. Mary lived 2 blocks away from Karen's house, and initially, the police didn't even interview residents of such distant houses. The fact that the woman heard the scream indicated that it was really very loud. However, the head of the neighborhood watch, who lived practically opposite Karen's house, described it as muffled. But if the neighbors 2 blocks away heard it, the man clearly could not consider it quiet, especially since at that moment he was in his garage with the door open. All this raised doubts, but the police were not quick to suspect the head of the neighborhood watch. He was 22-year-old George Lewis. He worked as a firefighter and was a good friend of almost all the employees of the local police station. He lived with his wife and young child, and all the neighbors spoke of him as a reliable and decent person. Nevertheless, detectives could not ignore Mary's story. They called George and asked him to come to the station when he had time. The man agreed, but never showed up. It is worth noting that before this, he regularly stopped by the station just to chat with his friends. The chief detective in this case was even at his wedding, so it was difficult for him to imagine George as a killer. Only a month later, in January 1985, they managed to talk to him. George insisted that the scream did not seem very loud to him. Perhaps this was due to the music playing from the radio. The detective asked him if he remembered anything else from that night, but George told him the same thing, except for one moment. When his testimony was taken for the first time, he said that he heard the scream, went out of the garage and walked down the street. But this time, he stated, he just walked up to the road, looked around, and then returned. Considering that many months had passed since then, this discrepancy in the testimonies did not seem serious. However, the police still decided to make sure that he was telling the truth and offered to undergo a polygraph test. George agreed, but to their surprise, he did not pass it. In a subsequent conversation with detectives, the man admitted that he had hidden one fact from them. He claimed that on the night Karen disappeared, he saw an unknown man near her house. George could only remember that the man was tall and had red hair and a beard. The detectives once again doubted whether he was telling the truth. George could not explain why he had not mentioned this man during the initial interview, except that he was afraid because the man knew where he lived and could harm his family. Despite this, the police tried to follow up on this lead and find the man, but the result was zero. Another nuance was that there was almost 30 meters between George and Karen's houses, and it was pitch dark outside. The detectives doubted that the man could see the color of another person's hair under such conditions, but George insisted on his story. The police recreated the events of that night and asked George to describe the man who stood 30 meters away from him. He could not see any details, which made the detectives even more suspicious of his words. Nevertheless, they walked around the area and asked local residents, "Have you noticed a suspicious man with red hair who could walk on their streets at night?" To their surprise, several women admitted that they had occasionally seen a man looking into their windows in the dark. None of them saw the face of this man, but one woman managed to notice him, and according to her, he looked very much like George Lewis. She was not 100% sure because it was dark outside, and the man immediately ran away. George admitted that he did sometimes look into his neighbor's windows, but he insisted that he did it solely for their safety. He said he was just trying to make sure everything was okay with them, since he was responsible for the security of his neighborhood as the head of the neighborhood watch. But all this only strengthened the suspicion against him. In March 1985, George agreed to a second polygraph test. This time, he changed his story again. He admitted that not only did he see a man in front of Karen's house, but he also approached him to talk, and the man threatened to kill him if he told anyone about him. The polygraph operator once again detected a lie, so the investigator asked George directly, "Did he kill Karen Gregory?" The man answered negatively, and once again, his words were considered false. Afterwards, the detectives decided to talk to George's wife, who told them that she had woken up that night from a piercing scream and was very frightened. She had tried to find her husband and went to the garage, but he was not there, and the light in the garage was turned off. The woman then returned home and sat in the kitchen, waiting for her husband, who only returned half an hour later. The detectives also decided to delve into George's biography and spoke with his ex-wife, who admitted that the man only seemed kind, caring, and responsible. In reality, he was very aggressive and raised his hand to her during frequent arguments. She added that he even choked her sometimes. Afterwards, the investigator spoke with George's close friends, who also shared some interesting information. Several months before the murder, when Karen was not yet living with him, but periodically visited him, George told his friends that he liked her. Moreover, the detectives learned that the man sometimes participated in orgies and mentioned that he wanted Karen to join them. During these conversations with George's friends, the police also learned that in the summer of 1984, the man had a secret affair with a young woman who lived a few houses away from him. They spoke with her and learned something else. The young woman admitted that on her 17th birthday, George gave her a white lace corset. It was too big for her, but the man still made her wear it regularly. The police asked her to give them the corset and immediately showed it to Karen's boyfriend. He said that an identical corset had gone missing from the house and that its size matched Karen's. It was the first serious evidence against George, but the detectives continued to dig further. They took a footprint from him and sent it to FBI experts to compare it to the footprint found on the bathroom floor in Karen's house. After some time, the results came in. A complete match. In March 1986, George was called back to the police station, and the detectives asked several times, was he in Karen's house on the night of the murder? The man denied it until the detective told him about the result of the examination. For the next few minutes, George continued to deny everything. But then he gave the police a new story. This time he said that he saw a red-haired man near Karen's house, then ran to her house and saw that everything around was bloody and the woman was lying in the hallway with a cut on her throat. Afterwards, he panicked and ran away from there, deciding never to remember that horror again. Of course, detectives didn't believe his story for a second because it sounded completely unbelievable. But George was right about one thing. There was indeed a cut on the victim's throat, which hadn't been disclosed publicly. Even if his story was true, he wouldn't have been able to see the cut due to the large amount of blood on Karen's body. At least experienced medical experts couldn't see it until the blood was washed away. This meant that George could only know about the cut if he was the killer. All of the above was enough to finally arrest the man. He was taken into custody on March 15, almost 2 years after the murder. In the state of Florida, he could have faced the death penalty for what he did. George's close friends and colleagues in the fire department didn't share the police's certainty that he was the killer. They still considered him a good person and made every effort to help him. These people gave part of their salary to George's wife and child and even raised $300,000 for bail. Several of his colleagues even mortgaged their homes. As a result, George was released in late December. He lived in his house for another 6 months, and the trial didn't begin until June 4, 1987. George's lawyers insisted that the man hadn't killed anyone and never changed his version of events in conversations with the police. However, when the suspect was given the floor, he came up with a completely new story. Its beginning was the same. He saw a man near Karen's residence, ran into the house, and saw her body. This sight made George very sick, and he ran to the bathroom where he vomited. Apparently, this was how he tried to explain the bloody footprint of his foot in the bathroom. But there was one obvious nuance here. If he had originally run into Karen's house barefoot, the bloody traces would have been from where he found her body to the bathroom, but they weren't there. When asked why he didn't call the police, George said that he was only 22 years old at the time and was too scared to tell anyone about it. It's worth noting that the man had been a firefighter since he was 18 and regularly dealt with horrific situations at work. But when he saw his dead neighbor, he suddenly couldn't even call the police. The prosecution insisted that George had feelings for Karen for several months. He waited until her boyfriend left for a week and decided to take advantage of the situation. George broke into her house and attacked her. Although the woman managed to scream and even resist him, in the end he killed her and subjected her to violence. As for the footprint of his foot on the bathroom floor, there could be a simple explanation. According to his wife, George came home only half an hour after the scream. Apparently, he tried to wash his clothes stained with Karen's blood in the bathroom and took off his shoes with socks, which also got blood on them. The trial lasted for 2 weeks, and in the end, the jury found him guilty. A month later, when his sentence was due to be announced, the judge suddenly scheduled a retrial. George's lawyers pushed for this, and they succeeded. They insisted that some evidence had been compromised by the police, and the prosecution had not been able to fully prove their client's guilt. The judge's decision came as a shock to all participants in the process, as it rarely happens. However, the prosecutor was able to challenge this decision, and in 1989, it was overturned. In the end, George was sentenced to life in prison. The death penalty was ruled out because the man had no criminal history prior to the murder. Since then, George has tried to challenge his sentence several times, but has been denied each time. Many of his friends and relatives continued to believe that he was innocent despite all the facts and evidence against him. George died in prison in 2014 at the age of 52. He insisted on his innocence until the very end and even gave an interview in which he talked about how difficult it was to bear the punishment for a crime he did not commit. In this whole story, one important point should be noted. 16 neighbors heard Karen scream, but none of them dared to call the police. Given that the police station was located near their street, the patrol could have arrived at the scene in a matter of minutes. The detectives who worked on this case admitted that in such a case, Karen's life could have been saved, but it did not happen. Sarah Yarborough was born on June 12, 1975 in Portland. Her parents soon moved to another state, settling in the town of Federal Way. It is near Seattle and is essentially a suburb of it. Sarah also had 2 brothers and helped her parents take care of the younger one and was very close to him. From an early age, Sarah was involved in music and ballet. The girl always strived to do well in school so she could get into a good college. Because of her academic performance, she flew twice to New Zealand in the school program. Later, Sarah joined her school's cheerleading team. She also had a great many friends. She was a kind and non-confrontational person, trying to help anyone in need. On Saturday morning, December 14, 1991, when she was 16, Sarah gathered for an event with her cheerleading team. They were to gather at the school building where the bus would pick them up. She took her dad's car and drove to school, only Sarah got the time wrong. She thought the bus would pick them up at 8 a.m., when in fact it wasn't supposed to arrive until 9. All her friends gradually started arriving at the place, but none of them saw Sarah. Some students saw her car in the parking lot, but there was no young woman inside, not even when the bus arrived for the students. Her friends thought this was strange, but no one could contact Sarah because none of them had cell phones at that time. Around the same time, 2 12-year-old boys were walking around the school grounds. Walking through the wooded area behind the school tennis courts, they noticed a strange man. He came out from behind the bushes, looked at them, and walked away in the opposite direction. He seemed strange to the children, but they did not pay much attention and walked on. Just a few meters away, a shocking sight awaited them. A young woman lying on the ground with no signs of life. Thinking she was dead, the school children ran home to tell their parents. While the parents of one of the boys went with him to the place, the father of the other decided to follow the suspicious man the children had seen. His son told him that he saw a car that looked like a Chevrolet Nova pulling away from that spot. Given that he lived near the school, his father decided to go outside and try to track down that car. At one point, he managed to locate a similar car, but it quickly disappeared from his sight and the man was unable to find it again. Meanwhile, the other boy's parents came to the school and realized that the young woman on the ground was probably dead. They immediately ran to the school building and called the police. Officers arrived on the scene and confirmed that the young woman was indeed dead. They were also quickly able to determine that the deceased was Sarah. From the marks on her neck, the officers concluded that the victim had most likely been strangled. Next to the body was some of her belongings: a jacket, underwear, and socks, with no other items near her. Officers found her purse and car keys inside the car in the school parking lot, leading them to believe that the perpetrator may have attacked her directly next to the car and then dragged her behind the trees. The body was turned over to medical examiners, and the police set about looking for clues. The first thing they did was try to interview all the people who were on and near the school grounds. The two guys who found Sarah gave a rough description of the man who had come out from behind the bushes near her body. They said he was a tall man in his early 20s with shoulder-length blonde hair, a dark raincoat, and black pants. Soon the police found another witness, and here a very surprising story awaited them. A man out for a jog noticed a strange picture in the same wooded area. A young woman was lying next to the bushes with a man hovering over her, and the young woman was not moving at all, and the witness thought that some couple had just decided to have some privacy. A few minutes later, he ran down the same road in the opposite direction, and the man and the young woman were still there. In both cases, it did not appear to him that he was watching a felony being committed. The witness himself explained to the police that he had only recently immigrated to the United States from another culture and was not sure what behavior was the norm in that country, but nevertheless, this witness gave the police a rough description of the killer, which matched the words of the children who discovered the body. Detectives interviewed several dozen other people who had been near the school, but no other useful leads were found. Meanwhile, medical experts examined Sarah's body and concluded that strangulation was the cause of her death. Apparently, the perpetrator used her own pantyhose. In addition, a serious injury was found on the young woman's head. The experts assumed that from this blow, the victim lost consciousness, which was consistent with the runner's story. He saw that the young woman on the ground did not move at all. Forensic investigators studied Sarah's clothing, and on almost every item, they found traces of male semen belonging to the same person. But in 1991, there was no common DNA database yet, so all the investigators could rely on was a direct comparison of DNA samples from specific suspects. There was another nuance that was brought to the detectives' attention. Even though forensic scientists found traces of male semen on Sarah's clothes, medical examiners stated that there were no signs of sexual abuse on her body. With all this information in hand, investigators formed their own view of what happened. Sarah arrived at the school almost an hour early, and there was no one in the parking lot but her. Her attacker most likely spotted her there, waited for the young woman to get out of the car, hit her on the head with an object, and Sarah lost consciousness. He then dragged her from the parking lot behind the trees where her body would later be found. The perpetrator removed some of her clothing and performed lewd acts on her before strangling the victim with her own stockings. When one of the children who found Sarah's body told police about the car in which the perpetrator allegedly fled the scene, detectives put out a search for a Chevrolet Nova, and soon they were able to find her. But here they were disappointed. It turned out that the driver of that car had just been delivering donuts that morning. He provided his DNA sample, which did not match that found on Sarah's clothes. Apparently, the kids just saw the car that drove down the road next to them and thought the perpetrator was behind the wheel. In fact, none of the boys could recall exactly whether they saw a man approaching any car from the bushes. Over the next few days, police continued to search for witnesses and new leads, but no significant progress was made. On Monday, school classes resumed, even though all the students were horrified by what had happened. In addition to the fact that the murder had taken place only a few meters from their school, the perpetrator was still at large, and his identity remained unknown. The young women were afraid to walk the grounds alone, so the boys on the sports teams arranged to walk each student to her car or bus so they would not be left alone on the street. Detectives determined that there were about 70 potential witnesses in and around the school that morning, and they talked to each of them, but no new details could be learned. Based on the accounts of the two children and the jogger, a rough portrait of the killer was compiled and distributed to all local newspapers and television stations. The story received extensive media coverage, and over the following weeks, the police received hundreds of tips. Investigators checked every one of them, but in all cases, they hit a dead end. At one point, they received a tip about a man who matched the killer's description and had a criminal history. But here, the detectives had a setback. His DNA did not match the perpetrator's sample. Since then, the case has been stalled for many months. In total, the police received about 4,000 different leads, and they tried to work with each of them. But the resources of the local police department were simply not enough to cope with so much information. Time also played against them, even as the investigators continued to search for the perpetrator, and each month there were new cases to be investigated. When Sarah's family learned that the police didn't have enough resources to handle all the tips, her grandfather tried to help as much as he could. He worked for a technology company and convinced management to temporarily provide the police department with a very powerful computer worth $150,000. It was a colossal sum in the 90s, but management still went along with it. With this computer, police officers could store information about all the leads in one place, process them at an increased speed, and sort them in a convenient form for quick study. Despite all this, every lead led them down a dead end, and they made no progress in the years that followed. 2 years later, Sarah's classmates graduated, and before graduation they decided to memorialize their friend. They raised an impressive sum of money and spent it to create a memorial. It was a bench on which Sarah's things were cast in metal. Next to these things, there was also a picture of the young woman's dog reaching for her purse. Over the years that followed, the case was periodically reopened, re-examining all the available evidence, but the result was the same. They were still unable to get any closer to catching the culprit. During this time, the police interviewed several thousand people and took DNA samples from nearly 300 possible suspects, but all this was inconclusive. In 2011, 20 years after the murder, the new detective decided to enlist the help of modern technology. He heard about a company that began working in the field of genetic genealogy. The policeman contacted them and asked, could they try to locate relatives of the person who left his DNA on the victim's body? And the experts undertook the task. Unfortunately, they failed. First of all, in 2011, genetic genealogy was just gaining momentum, and the experts were very limited in their capabilities. For example, they have not learned to search for male and female relatives in one sample. If they had the DNA of a man, they could only look for family ties with other men and vice versa. Secondly, they had another obstacle in front of them in the form of various laws that prohibited the use of genetic data samples to search for relatives of suspects. Nevertheless, it bore some interesting fruit. For one thing, the team of researchers approached by the detective had already been working for several years to create a genetic pedigree of the first people who sailed to the United States from Great Britain in 1620 on the ship Mayflower. After studying the DNA of the killer Sarah, they discovered that the man was related to one of the ship's passengers, Robert Fuller. However, it was almost impossible to trace him through this chain, especially in those years. There were just over 100 people on the ship, but over the centuries the number of their descendants has exceeded 25 million, and secondly, the detectives had no idea that he had made the Sarah Yarborough case the first of its kind. Although his idea was not successful, it was the first crime that was attempted to solve with the help of genetic genealogy. The detective tried to use the information available and tracked down several men with the Fuller surname who were living in the area of his town at the time of Sarah's murder. He found photos of them and met the only witness, a jogger, and two men who had found the body as children. Unfortunately, neither of them recognized the killer in the photo. Finally, the investigators asked for DNA samples from all Fuller in the area and sent them to the laboratory. None of them matched the DNA of the killer. But something interesting happened here. The experts established that one of those men was indeed a distant descendant of Robert Fuller from that very ship. However, he was definitely not the killer and also did not know that any distant relatives lived near him. The perpetrator may have been so distantly related to him that their family simply never knew of the connection. The detective retired in 2017 and the case was turned over to a new team. Investigators revisited the company which had taken on the killer's DNA sample in 2011. By that time, the ability to study genetic material had advanced a great deal, and experts agreed to try to trace the perpetrator's lineage. It took 2 whole years. The experts used public databases to find even the most distant relatives of the killer. Then they manually tried to trace their family ties and reach people who lived in Federal Way at the time of Sarah's death. In all, they had to weed out several thousand people before they finally got lucky. Experts determined that a DNA sample from Sarah's clothes was highly likely to belong to one of the 2 brothers. At the time of the murder, one was 33 years old and the other was 27. The older one turned out to be a criminal with an impressive criminal record. He had been in prison for violent crimes and his DNA sample was in the FBI database, which meant that he had nothing to do with Sarah's murder because then his DNA would have shown a match back in the 90s. As for the younger brother, named Patrick Nicholas, he too has been on the police's radar for violent crimes, including crimes against minors. But that was before the DNA samples of such criminals were added to the database. Detectives immediately organized a surveillance of the man. The man, who was 55 at the time, lived in a neighboring town called Wellington. The cops had been following his every move for 2 days, and soon the opportunity presented itself. Patrick went to the laundry, and while he was waiting for his clothes to be washed, he went out to smoke and threw his cigarette butt on the ground. One of the cops immediately took it into an evidence bag and returned to his car. Patrick went out to smoke a second time, and this time a rag handkerchief fell out of his pocket. The men didn't pick it up and went back to the laundry room, and the police were happy to take the second piece of evidence in case the experts were not able to get a DNA sample from the cigarette butt. However, the experts were easily able to extract samples from all these items, and the very next day they told the detective the long-awaited news. Patrick's DNA was a perfect match to the semen found on Sarah's clothes in 1991. The judge immediately issued a warrant for the man's arrest, and the police took him into custody. It all took 5 days from when investigators first learned his name to the formal murder charges. When his biography was leaked to the media, many began to ask the perfectly logical question: why was a man with such a criminal history not even considered a suspect for all those 28 years? At age 19, Patrick Nicholas approached a young woman and got into her car where he tried to abuse her. The victim managed to escape, but to do so, she had to jump into the river and swim for a long time until she was a safe distance from the perpetrator. Patrick spent 4 years in prison, after which he was released. The next crime that the police caught him for was in 1994, when he tried to abuse an underage young woman. He was arrested again, but his DNA was not entered in any database. The reason for that is strange. The article he was prosecuted for was not hard enough to collect DNA, and the police never came across his name in 3 decades. He also didn't appear in any of the 4,000 leads obtained over the years. It also turned out why genetic genealogy experts could not trace him back to Robert Fuller. It turned out that Patrick's biological grandfather was adopted and grew up under the adoptive family name. One of the men who discovered Sarah's body as children in 1991 immediately stated that Patrick was without a doubt the killer. He admitted that the incident had had a profound effect on him. He was only 12 at the time the body was discovered, and the perpetrator had seen his face. For years, the witness was constantly afraid that the killer would come after him, and it was only after Patrick's arrest that he finally felt safe. Patrick's trial did not begin until 2023. The man insisted on his innocence, and his lawyer tried to challenge the main evidence, DNA. In his opinion, the presence of Patrick's semen on the clothes of the murdered young woman did not prove his guilt. But this argument did not work. The lawyer also tried to challenge the accuracy of the DNA analysis itself, but the experts declared the absolute invalidity of such claims. Patrick was eventually found guilty of first-degree murder without prior intent. On May 25th, he was sentenced to 45 years and 8 months in prison, virtually eliminating the possibility of ever getting out. During the pronouncement of that sentence, Patrick showed no emotion, unlike Sarah's relatives. They also spoke before the judge, thanking everyone involved in the trial and the investigators for bringing the killer to justice, even though he had managed to evade justice for 28 years. Nona Dirksmeyer was born on December 26, 1985, in Russellville, Arkansas. She grew up in a very large family. She had 4 brothers and 1 sister. When Nona was 10 years old, her father passed away. This event was a tragedy for the entire family, but they were soon to face an even more terrible shock. Sometime later, the young woman confessed to her mother that her father had repeatedly subjected her to violence. She was afraid to speak up while he was alive, and her confession was a real shock to her mother. The woman had no idea what her husband was capable of. Despite such a tragic experience, Nona found the strength to move on and later decided to help other young women who had become victims of similar crimes. For this, she joined a volunteer organization where she provided support to children in need. During her school years, Nona began dating a guy named Kevin Jones. The young woman also took part in beauty contests, achieving significant success in this field. Nona won several local contests, which allowed her to compete for the title of Miss Arkansas. In addition, the young woman actively participated in the life of the local church and sang in the choir. After high school, when Nona was 19, she and her boyfriend enrolled in Arkansas Tech University, located in their hometown. The young woman decided to rent her own apartment as she wanted to start an independent life. After completing her first year, her boyfriend decided to change his major and transferred to another university, which was an hour-and-a-half drive from their city. By that time, the couple had been dating for about 5 years, and it was their first time they had to live in different cities. On December 14, 2005, Kevin returned home for Christmas holidays. He stopped by Nona's apartment before heading to his parents' home, which was about 16 kilometers away from the city. The next day, both of them had plans. Nona had to take her last 2 exams and also meet with a young woman from the volunteer organization. Kevin was going to take his mom, who worked as a librarian, to a school event. On the morning of December 15th, at around 9 a.m., Nona sent a message to Kevin, wishing him a good day. He was waiting for Nona to call him after her exams and let him know how they went. but she wasn't answering his calls or messages, and he began to worry. Around 6 p.m., Kevin took his mother to the school event, but he couldn't shake the thought. Why isn't Nona answering her phone all day? Eventually, Kevin decided to call his friend who worked as a pizza delivery guy in the area where Nona's apartment complex was located. Kevin asked him to stop by and check if everything was okay. His friend quickly arrived there and saw that Nona's car was parked in the parking lot and the lights were on in her apartment, but nobody was answering the door. He told Kevin about this, and then Kevin told his mother that he was worried about his girlfriend and wanted to go to her apartment to check if everything was okay. The woman agreed, and they went to the apartment complex together. Kevin's friend was waiting for them there, and all three of them started knocking on the door, but there was still no answer. Kevin had a key, but he left it at home that day because he didn't plan on stopping by Nona's. A few minutes later, Kevin and his friend tried to open the front door because they thought something bad might have happened to Nona, but they couldn't get in. Then Kevin remembered that there were sliding glass doors in the back of the apartment. Approaching them, he immediately noticed something strange. Nona took her safety seriously, so every time she was home alone, she put a special removable grill on the back glass door. They are mainly used against burglars. They are easy to install and remove from inside the house, but it's extremely difficult to do so from the outside. But this time, there was no grill, and the doors themselves were unlocked. Once inside the apartment, they immediately noticed blood on the blinds, and a shocking sight awaited them in the bedroom. Nona was lying face down in a pool of blood, wearing nothing but socks. Kevin rushed to her and tried to lift her, but immediately realized she was dead. Meanwhile, his mother called the police. Investigators arrived at the apartment and began examining the crime scene. They immediately suspected that the victim had been struck multiple times on the head with a table lamp that was found on the floor. They also discovered a bloody fingerprint on the lamp, which they believe may have been left by the killer. Next to the victim's body, they found her phone with the battery removed. On the bedside table, investigators found an empty condom wrapper. After examining all the doors and windows, they found no signs of forced entry. Medical examiners studied the victim's body and confirmed that the table lamp had been used as a weapon, with the metal base of the lamp matching the victim's head injuries. In addition, the victim had multiple knife wounds. According to the pathologist, the victim had died between 10:30 a.m. and 1 p.m., and there were no signs of violence, which puzzled the detectives, considering that the victim was found without clothing. They first suspected a sexual motive for the crime. However, experts suggested that the perpetrator may have used a condom, the wrapper of which was found in the apartment, making it practically impossible to determine the presence of sexual violence. In the end, the police had no evidence, but one interesting detail emerged. The crime scene was not thoroughly examined, with investigators failing to collect blood samples from the blinds on the back door or a search for shoe prints in the apartment, which could have been used as evidence. Moreover, they didn't even go to the second floor of the apartment. These oversights were explained by the fact that the investigators found their suspect, the victim's boyfriend, almost immediately after arriving at the scene. The first thing that made them suspect Kevin's involvement in the murder was the fact that he had a large amount of the victim's blood on him. When he entered the apartment and ran to her, he tried to lift her up, and upon realizing that she was dead, he hugged and held her. The police found this behavior strange and suspected that Kevin had done it deliberately. By hugging the victim and getting covered in her blood, he may have destroyed potential evidence and compromised the crime scene. Why it would be difficult for investigators to prove his guilt, for example, if Kevin's clothes or nails were found with the victim's blood, it could easily be explained that he hugged the victim after discovering her body. Another suspicious moment was that Kevin went to check on his girlfriend, not alone, but with his mother, and he also invited his friend to the apartment. Investigators believe that this way he secured two witnesses who found the body with him and saw him covered in blood. The police talked to Kevin for a long time right outside Nona's apartment, and from their questions, the young man realized that they considered him a suspect. Then he said something that made the investigators even more convinced that he was the killer. Understanding that he was suspected, Kevin began arguing with the investigators and mentioned that he constantly watches Law and Order and knows that they are trying to make him guilty. These words also seemed strange to the police. In addition, they found out that the key to Nona's apartment was only with 3 people: the girlfriend herself, her mother, and Kevin. Considering that no signs of breaking in were found, they assumed that the guy used his copy of the key to enter the apartment. Kevin was taken to the police station for interrogation. For several hours, he told his version of events that day and insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder. In turn, investigators directly accused him of this and urged him to confess. During the interrogation, another fact emerged that the police considered strange. Around 4 p.m., after numerous attempts to call his girlfriend, Kevin sent a message: "Are you alive?" Given at that time Nona was already dead, the investigators found this suspicious. While the guy did not demand a lawyer and tried to answer all questions, the investigators talked to him for several hours, constantly increasing pressure. Towards the end, they not only accused him of the murder directly, but also manipulated the facts. Detectives said several times that there was incontrovertible evidence against him, and the only way to lighten his fate was to confess to everything. After the police left the interrogation room and left him alone, Kevin stood up and started punching the back of the chair. For the investigators, this became another sign that the young man had a tendency to violence and could commit murder. However, in reality, the police had no evidence that could link Kevin to the murder. Medical experts found that Nona had tried to fend off her attacker, meaning that there should have been bruises and scratches on the killer's body, but none were found on Kevin. Despite this, the detectives continued to believe he was guilty and tried to find evidence. They interviewed over 50 people, hoping to find any witnesses, but it yielded no results. However, after talking with Nona's friends, the police learned something important. It turned out that shortly before her death, she had started seeing another guy secretly from Kevin. Investigators immediately checked this person, but he had a solid alibi for the time of the murder, and this fact added even more suspicion to Kevin because now he had a motive. The young man could have come to Nona's house without warning, seen an empty contraceptive package, and realized that she was cheating on him. In a fit of rage, he could have killed her and then fled the scene and planned a way to avoid responsibility. This version was consistent with the nature of the injuries inflicted on the victim. She was killed with particular cruelty, which in most similar cases indicates strong personal animosity of the killer towards the victim. A few days later, Kevin agreed to undergo a polygraph test. The operator concluded that the young man gave numerous false answers, and one of the investigators even claimed that this was the worst result on a polygraph in his 28-year career. However, there is one caveat here. The person who read the device's readings was not a certified specialist. He was just a police officer who had not undergone the necessary training to work with this device. But this did not bother the detectives. After the interrogation, they again put pressure on Kevin, trying to force a confession. They claimed that all his acquaintances and relatives already knew that he killed Nona. The police really told everyone that Kevin's guilt was practically proven and that he would soon be arrested. They convinced the victim's parents that he was the one who killed their daughter, although they refused to believe it until the end. The day before the funeral, a farewell ceremony was supposed to take place in the church, and Kevin had been helping to organize it since early in the morning. Later on, detectives called him in for questioning again, promising to release him before the start of the ceremony. In the end, Kevin spent 7 hours at the police station and missed the ceremony. Nobody present knew he was being questioned, so many assumed that Kevin didn't show up due to guilt over what had happened. Nona's parents didn't even want him to come to the funeral, as investigators had already convinced them of his involvement in the murder. But Kevin still came and sat far away from her relatives. By that time, experts had finished examining the evidence that the police had taken from the victim's apartment. Upon inspecting the light bulb and the desk lamp, they found a fingerprint that belonged to Kevin. It had been left by Nona's blood, which indicated that the fingerprint could only have been made during or after the murder. This became the only available evidence for the investigators, but they continued to dig under Kevin for several more months, hoping to find more evidence. They were unable to do so, and on March 31, 2006, they decided to try to obtain a conviction with the available evidence. The young man was arrested and charged with murder. At that time, many residents still believed that he was guilty, so Kevin's lawyers first requested a change of venue to another district. They were concerned that the jurors might be negatively predisposed against their client and render a guilty verdict without sufficient evidence. This request was granted, and the trial began in another city. The defense called a witness who provided Kevin with a solid alibi. A plumber had come to his parents' house that morning and saw him there around 10:30 a.m. The prosecution insisted that Kevin could have had time to go to Nona's and commit the murder, as, according to medical experts, she had died between 10:30 a.m. and 1 p.m. They also presented an interesting fact. Kevin's phone had been turned off between 10:30 a.m. and 12 p.m. This time frame coincided with the time of the victim's murder. Furthermore, data from Kevin's phone showed that he only started calling his girlfriend at 4:30 p.m. Although during questioning, he claimed that he had been trying to contact her all day. However, at that time, the young man may have meant not only calls but also messages. Lawyers presented 2 more witnesses whose testimony disproved the possibility of Kevin committing the murder. One of them was Kevin's grandmother. She said that on that day she saw her grandson near the gas station and gave him some money to have a snack at a cafe. Another witness saw the guy between 12:30 and 1 p.m. near the restaurant, and the establishment's cameras recorded him having lunch. Thus, the young man simply could not have committed the murder and returned back in time. Lawyers also challenged the fact that Kevin could have left a bloody fingerprint on the lamp during the murder. In that case, by the time the body was discovered, the blood should have dried up, and the experts who came to the apartment that evening wrote in the report that the bloody fingerprint was slightly damp, confirming that Kevin could have left it accidentally when he found Nona's body with his mother and friend. But that's not all. It turned out that based on the table lamp, which was used to hit the victim, fingerprints were also found, but they did not belong to Kevin, and checking them against the databases did not yield any results. Lawyers insisted that these fingerprints belonged to the real killer. Lawyers also pointed out that the police did a very poor job from the first minutes. They did not inspect the entire apartment, which could have missed many potential clues. At the trial, a medical expert who examined the victim's body spoke, and here an interesting statement awaited all participants in the process. He determined that after death, the victim's body lay on her back for some time, after which she was turned face down. This could indicate that the young woman was still subjected to violence. The expert confirmed that he did not find any direct signs of this, but added that he could not rule out such a scenario. Finally, lawyers presented the main trump card. According to the official statement of the prosecution, no fingerprints or DNA were found on the empty contraceptive package found next to the victim's body, but lawyers ordered a retest, and this time, the experts found male DNA. The analysis showed that it did not belong to Kevin, and checking it against the databases did not yield any results. The trial lasted over a year, but in July 2007, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Kevin not guilty of the murder of Nona due to lack of evidence. For the victim's relatives, who had believed him to be the killer from the first weeks, this decision was a shock. They continued to believe that Kevin was responsible for her death, and now he had managed to avoid punishment. Despite their client being acquitted, the legal team promised to continue working on the case and find the real killer. Considering that the police were fixated on Kevin, no one expected them to finally do their job properly. The first thing the lawyers did was to get the DNA from the contraceptive packaging compared to all the men who knew Nona. All these people voluntarily provided their samples, and none of them matched. This went on for 2 months, until something unexpected happened in September 2007. The police arrested a man named Gary Dunn for robbery, and that's when things got interesting. Firstly, this man had already been convicted for attacking another woman. Secondly, he lived in the same residential complex as Nona. Thirdly, in the early stages of the investigation, the police considered him a suspect, but quickly switched their focus to Kevin as they believed he was the killer. Given all this, the boys' lawyers requested a DNA test, and there was a long-awaited breakthrough. The sample from the contraceptive packaging matched Gary's DNA. It turned out that after the young woman's murder, investigators even questioned him using a polygraph. Gary, who was 26 at the time, passed it completely, even though in that case, the interrogation was also conducted by a non-certified specialist. Moreover, none of them even checked this person's alibi. Then, Gary said that during the murder, he was shopping with his mother. After his DNA matched the sample from the victim's apartment, investigators finally bothered to check this information, and the alibi turned out to be false. Gary really went shopping with his mother, just not at the time of the murder, but 2 days before that, as confirmed by the receipts with the purchase dates, and Gary even showed them to the police, but they simply disregarded such important information. They saw the dates on the checks did not match the day of the murder. This was stated in the reports, but for some unknown reason, they either did not attach importance to this or somehow did not notice that the days did not match. In the end, experts compared his fingerprints with those found on Nona's table lamp, and they matched. However, a serious problem arose here. The fingerprints and DNA matched, but not 100%. The judicial system has certain norms according to which the necessary coincidence indicators are established for guilt recognition. In Gary's case, these indicators were insufficient. Although there were practically no chances that the DNA and fingerprints belonged to someone else, and here, with a high degree of probability, the investigators were guilty. Firstly, they did not study all the available evidence immediately after the murder, as the rules require. It is possible that the DNA samples deteriorated slightly while it was not properly studied a year after the murder. Secondly, the police could have missed many other clues because they simply did not search the entire apartment. As soon as the detectives received all this information, They arrested Gary and charged him with Nona's murder. Interestingly, at the time of her death, the man was on parole. In 2002, he attacked a woman who was running in the park, knocked her down and started beating her, also telling her that he was going to kill her. The woman managed to escape and ran to her car. Meanwhile, Gary fled the scene but was quickly found. The man spent 19 months in prison, after which he was released early. Interestingly, his DNA sample was not entered into the database. The trial of Gary began in April 2010, and there were many interesting things waiting for everyone. His own wife testified against him, saying that he was an aggressive and dangerous man. Gary regularly raised his hand against her, and the woman seriously feared for her life, so she was afraid to leave him. But the most interesting thing was that a few weeks before the victim's death, she saw her husband spying on Nona through the window of her apartment. Based on this, the prosecution assumed that the man had premeditated the attack. Given his criminal history, Gary clearly had a tendency towards violence, and he may have been keeping a close eye on Nona since she lived just a few meters away from him. On December 15th, he decided to act. Apparently, he knocked on her apartment door and came inside under a false pretense, where he grabbed a table lamp and struck her several times before assaulting and killing her. Because Gary used contraception, medical experts could not definitively say whether the victim had been sexually assaulted, but all the evidence pointed to it. Gary's lawyers denied his involvement, but he had no real alibi, so they focused on trying to blame Kevin. According to the lawyers, Kevin found out that the young woman was cheating on him and killed her. Kevin even had to testify in court and listen as they tried to paint him as the true criminal. Unfortunately, the prosecution could not use Gary's fingerprint or DNA as evidence, even though the match was practically undeniable. As a result, the jury could not come to a unanimous decision, and the trial was declared a mistrial. A new trial was not far behind, and its key difference was that a woman who Gary had nearly killed in 2002 testified in court. She told how the man had attacked her and how she barely managed to escape. But despite this, the second trial also ended in nothing, as the jurors did not reach a consensus. Consequently, Gary Dunn walked free as a free man, although his guilt was practically obvious. But a few years later, he did earn himself a prison sentence. In 2018, when Gary was 39, he committed 2 separate crimes in one day. First, he attempted to kidnap a woman from a church parking lot, but she managed to fight him off. A few hours later, Gary stripped down in front of another woman in a mall parking lot and was soon arrested. Given his criminal history and the fact that he is practically a killer of Nona, the court decided to sentence him to the maximum term. Gary received 15 years in prison for these 2 incidents, and he is serving his sentence to this day. Despite having the right to petition for early release, authorities are unlikely to grant Gary such an opportunity. Additionally, they have the right to accuse him of Nona's murder for the 3rd time, but they're not rushing to do so. The likelihood of the new trial ending in the same way as the previous 2 is very high, so investigators are trying to gather more evidence and prepare a stronger case against Gary. As for Kevin, after everything that happened, he pursued a study of law, and in 2011, he sued 2 police officers from the authorities of Russellville and Gary Dunn. He claimed that they were trying to pin someone else's crime on him, ignoring many clues and refusing to do their job properly. During the preparation for the trial, Kevin found out that, in fact, Gary's polygraph test results also showed lies, but investigators still did not consider him a suspect. Unfortunately, his lawsuit was dismissed due to the statute of limitations. As a result, negligent police officers did not face any consequences for letting the real killer roam free for years and may be there again in a few years. They will also not be punished for the fact that all acquaintances and relatives of Nona believed for years that Kevin was the murderer. Only a few years ago, her parents stopped believing this and restored their relationship with him. Now, Kevin works as a lawyer and strives to help those who suffer from police negligence or unprofessionalism. Gemma McCluskey was born on February 5, 1983, in England. She grew up in a large family. The girl had 2 older brothers and loving parents. In her teenage years, Gemma decided to try herself as an actress, and in 1997, she got a few minor roles. In 2000, when she was 17, she was offered a role in one of the most popular British TV series called EastEnders. In total, Gemma appeared in more than 30 episodes. After that, she had to temporarily give up her acting career because her mother became seriously ill and someone had to take care of her. The woman was diagnosed with a brain tumor, which was successfully operated on, but unfortunately, she got infected during the operation, which could not be treated. Since then, Gemma lived in an apartment with her mother and brother Tony. She worked as a waitress in several bars and clubs, and her brother took care of their mother in her absence. In March 2012, when Gemma was 29, she was, as usual, taking care of her mother, going to work, and occasionally meeting with friends. But one day, her acquaintances realized that no one could reach Gemma. She didn't answer her phone, didn't respond to messages on social media, and didn't appear online. She had quite a few friends, and they quickly suspected something was wrong. Together, they concluded that no one had seen Gemma for several days. The last time she met with her friend, Erica, was on March 1st, and since then, Gemma had not been seen or heard from. On March 3rd, her brother went to the club where she was supposed to work that day, but the staff said that Gemma never showed up. That's when Tony and his brother, Danny, decided to go to the police. They knew that their sister would never leave their sick mother without warning, so they doubted that she had just left on her own. Investigators received a report of a missing person and first questioned Tony, whose testimony was crucial as he lived with Gemma and could have been the last person to see her. However, there was a problem. For many years, Tony had been using marijuana in large quantities, and the entire family knew about his addiction. Because of this habit, he constantly experienced problems with memory and concentration, so he couldn't even remember the specific day he last saw Gemma. Eventually, he remembered seeing his sister on March 1st. On that day, as usual, he had consumed a large amount of marijuana and nearly caused a flood in the apartment. Tony decided to fill the bathtub and forgot about it, causing water to overflow. But luckily, Gemma was home and turned off the water. After that, she left the apartment to meet her friend Erica. Tony said he left his room around 6 p.m. and his sister was still missing. Gemma and Erica discussed the bathtub incident, and Gemma once again complained about how tired she was of her brother's behavior. He worked as a window cleaner, but spent almost all his money on marijuana, even though he was 35 years old, and Gemma often felt like she had to constantly look after him. The next day, after reporting to the police, Erica met with Tony to discuss the situation again and try to think together about where his sister could have gone. The man was depressed, often started crying, and blamed himself for what had happened. He said that because of the bathtub incident, Gemma once again became disappointed in him. It was not the first time that his addiction had upset his relatives. Meanwhile, Gemma's friends turned to the local newspaper, asking to write about her disappearance. Reporters spoke to Gemma's brother and wrote an article. Everyone hoped that media coverage would help find witnesses who might have seen the woman. On March 5th, Gemma's cousins decided to organize large-scale searches. They attracted dozens of volunteers who searched the streets and handed out flyers to passerby. The sisters also actively disseminated information through social networks, hoping to get any leads. On March 6th, they did receive their first lead, but not in the form they had hoped. Tony received a call from an unknown number, telling him that if he wanted to see his sister alive, he needed to bring £2 million sterling to the Benefit railway station, located outside of London. Shortly after, there was a second call from the same unknown person, stating that in addition to the money, he also needed to bring $500 in Iraqi currency. After this, there was a third call, in which the mysterious person threatened to kill Gemma if they didn't get the money. Tony asked to speak to his sister, but the caller said that she was locked in another room and added that the woman was regularly subjected to violence, so he advised Tony to hurry with the money. The same person also called Danny, the missing woman's other brother. The police tried to trace these calls. Despite the fact that the number was hidden in all cases, they quickly managed to find the caller. He was a 19-year-old boy named Sam Dunn who lived in Kent County. His home was relatively close to the railway station where the caller demanded the money to be brought. A judge issued a search warrant for his home, and Dunn was arrested. However, soon after, the police came to the conclusion that the boy had nothing to do with Gemma's disappearance, as he admitted during interrogation. He and his friends saw a post on social media about the woman's disappearance and decided to play a prank. There were two numbers, Tony and Danny. However, investigators quickly discovered that there were inaccuracies in this story as well. The boy said that the calls were made by his friend, and he was just sitting next to him. The police established that the caller was actually Sam and could not find any other people involved. As a result, the court did not appreciate his joke and sentenced the boy to 6 months in prison. The detectives once again had no leads. They recreated the chronology of that day and established that Gemma left Erica's apartment at around 13:17 and went home along the way. She called Tony several times and arrived at her home at 13:50. This was confirmed by CCTV footage. After 18 minutes, her phone was turned off, and it had not been turned on since. At that point, the police were almost certain that Gemma had been abducted, but there was something strange about the timing of her movements. Most likely, her abductor had turned off her phone. But how could he have done that 18 minutes after the woman arrived home? The most logical explanation would be that Gemma was attacked right in her apartment. But at that time, Tony was there, and their mother was in the hospital. Investigators came to an alarming conclusion and thought, could her own brother have something to do with her disappearance? He consumed a lot of weed, and people with serious addictions are often capable of monstrous acts. Digging deeper, detectives learned that Gemma's sister and mother had called the police on Tony several times. Sometimes he behaved aggressively and even attacked Gemma. The brothers' behavior during the investigation also raised questions. While Danny and Gemma's friends were actively involved in the search, Tony sat at home. He explained that he hoped for Gemma's return and wanted to be at home in case she came back. Only after the case began to be talked about on major TV channels did he finally join the search. Police spoke to him again, trying to get more specific answers about the timeline of events on that day. Tony said he saw his sister between 1:30 p.m. and 3 p.m., and after that she went somewhere. Considering that her phone was turned off at 2:08 p.m., his story raised questions. On the other hand, Tony was under the influence of weed almost 24/7, and relying on his memory would not be entirely objective. On March 6th, 5 days after Gemma's disappearance, there was an extremely alarming turn in the case. A boatman was sailing along one of London's canals, and at some point a suitcase hit his boat. Upon collision, it opened, and the shocked boatman saw its contents. There was a human body inside. Experts examined it and immediately noticed that the torso was missing its head, legs, and arms. It was a female body with a bow tattoo on the lower back, the same as Gemma's. So investigators immediately requested DNA analysis to identify the body. They took DNA from her toothbrush and obtained a complete match. The deceased was Gemma McCluskey. Her relatives and friends were shocked by the news of the woman's death and the gruesome details of her body being found in a suitcase. No one could believe that something so terrible had happened to her. Now the police were dealing with a murder case, and everyone was waiting for them to catch the culprit. The very next day, on March 7th, they made a loud statement. Investigators announced that Tony McCluskey had been arrested on suspicion of murder. His inability to remember the timeline of that day and strange behavior during the search for Gemma suggested that he was not at all interested in finding his own sister, or he knew that she was already dead. In addition, the time frame of her disappearance made Tony the most obvious suspect. Given that he had a fight about the overflowing bathtub that day, as well as his known addiction, police assumed that he might have snapped and killed his sister. The use of marijuana in large quantities over a long period of time can lead to serious mental problems, and a person is fully capable of committing spontaneous crimes. During the first interrogation, detectives became even more convinced that Tony could indeed be the killer. Instead of denying his guilt in his sister's murder, he answered all questions with one short phrase: "No comment." Investigators examined his smartphone, where they found correspondence with his sister. The day after her disappearance, he sent Gemma a message saying, "I love you." And a few hours later, he wrote, "Gem, call me when you get this message. What do we have for dinner today? Are you working tonight?" Detectives noticed one strange fact. Their correspondence with his sister dated back many years, but he never once wrote that he loved her, only on the day after her disappearance. On the same day, he wrote to his girlfriend and apologized for not getting in touch with her the night before. None of this pointed to his guilt, but soon police found much more serious evidence. They learned that on the day of Gemma's disappearance, Tony ordered a taxi to an address near the house using a fake name, Tom. Learning the route from the company, investigators obtained recordings from surveillance cameras in the area. On the first frames of the footage taken during the man's taxi ride, they saw Tony loading a large suitcase into the trunk. It was clear that it was very heavy, and the driver's testimony confirmed this fact. Seeing the man struggling to lift the suitcase, he asked him, "What's inside?" Tony claimed it was a large music system. He asked to be taken to the street next to the canal, where his sister's body would later be found. After questioning the locals in the area, the police found one witness, a student who was standing on the balcony of her apartment, saw a man dragging a large suitcase towards the canal. Experts examined the taxi trunk and found traces of blood. DNA analysis showed that it belonged to Gemma. With these clues in hand, detectives were convinced that Tony was transporting the same suitcase with his sister's body, and on March 10th, he was charged with murder. The police conducted a search of their apartment and found even more alarming evidence: a knife with barely noticeable traces of blood, and there were also blood stains in the bathroom that they tried to wash away. All of this indicated that the woman was killed in her own home, but one moment raised questions for the detectives. Given that the woman's head, arms, and legs were separated from the body, there should have been much more blood. Experts studied the drainage pipes throughout the house, but they did not find significant traces of blood there. They speculated that Tony laid something like plastic wrap or tarp on the bathroom floor, and then gradually disposed of the blood with a large amount of cleaning agents. The day after the murder, Tony was caught on store cameras buying trash bags. According to investigators, he could use them to carry out the remaining parts of the body from the house. Soon this version was confirmed. Divers who continued to search the canal found bags with legs and arms at the bottom of the same canal. Even without DNA analysis, everyone already understood that they belonged to Gemma, and later, laboratory experts only confirmed this fact. Despite a serious set of evidence against Tony, he still did not speak to investigators, and they decided to change tactics. The police showed his father footage from cameras where Tony was seen putting the suitcase in the taxi trunk on the day of Gemma's murder. The father was convinced that his son was involved in the murder, so he agreed to talk to him and try to get a confession. This tactic worked, but only partially. During the conversation, Tony told his father what had happened that day. According to him, Gemma came home and started to fight over the bathtub being full, demanding that her brother move out of her apartment, but he refused. When Tony decided to go to his room, Gemma allegedly grabbed a knife and he didn't remember anything after that. Investigators didn't believe this story for a second, as it sounded like an attempt to shift the blame for the murder. Therefore, they continued to search for additional evidence. On March 9th, police found Gemma's head in the same canal, and experts were finally able to determine the cause of death. The woman had received several blows with a sharp object, and the injuries matched the kitchen knife found in her apartment. Since then, detectives have been preparing the case for trial, and Tony has been in custody. The trial lasted almost a year, during which time the victim's brother gradually began to admit his guilt. He constantly exchanged letters with his father, but continued to insist that he didn't remember the moment of the murder. Nevertheless, Tony admitted that he was the one who killed his sister. According to him, during the argument, he essentially blacked out and couldn't control himself. Tony insisted that he never wanted his sister to die and couldn't have done such a thing in a sane state of mind. The trial began in January 2013. The prosecution believed that Tony flew into rage during the argument with his sister when she asked him to move out of the apartment. Given his penchant for marijuana, he simply wouldn't have had enough money to rent his own place. Perhaps this played a significant role in what happened next. Based on the experts' conclusions, the prosecution claimed that Tony stabbed his sister several times, leading to her death. He then laid something like a tarp in the bathroom and took the body there, after which he dismembered it. Based on CCTV footage, Tony put Gemma's torso in a suitcase and threw it into the canal. After that, he carried other body parts and other evidence in garbage bags over several trips, some of which he also threw into the water. His father couldn't even bear to listen to it all. He left the courtroom and only returned after they stopped discussing the details of his daughter's murder. Tony himself admitted that he was most likely the one who killed Gemma, but he didn't remember it at all. According to him, it could have been self-defense, as his sister allegedly shouted at him with a knife in her hand, and what happened next was unknown. The prosecution considered his version to be a blatant lie. A psychotherapist was invited as a witness who claimed that memory loss due to marijuana use is extremely rare. In addition, Tony clearly planned to hide what he had done by getting rid of the body. It took him many hours, and amnesia and a state of shock should have passed fairly quickly. Not only did he dismember her body and scatter it around different places of the canal, but he also called a taxi under a false name and thoroughly cleaned the bathroom floor afterward. All of this indicated that Tony was fully aware of what he was doing and planned to avoid punishment by getting rid of all possible evidence. Gemma's childhood friend also testified in court, revealing that her brother had been beating and humiliating her from an early age. Sometimes Gemma had to wear sunglasses to hide the signs of physical abuse. According to the witness, Tony always despised his sister and felt no emotions toward her. He lived with her and their mother only because it was convenient for him. He didn't have to pay rent or even for food. Tony spent almost all of his salary on weed, and this lifestyle suited him perfectly. But when his sister tried to kick him out, he snapped and killed her. The trial ended on January 30th, and the jury found Tony guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 20 years. In his closing statement, the judge said that Tony disposed of the victim's body like a true maniac and apparently hoped it would never be found. The killer showed no emotion during the reading of the verdict or the trial itself. There was no evidence that he felt any remorse for what he had done. After Tony began serving his sentence, he was transferred from one prison to another because someone had put a price on his head. It is unknown whether this was related to the murder of Gemma or if he had quarreled with other inmates. Tony's father, who had tried to support his son throughout the trial, ultimately decided to cut off all contact with him. The man said that he did not want to turn away from Tony as he would lose 2 children at once, and besides, he was his own son, and he simply could not abandon him. But in the end, he realized that Tony felt no remorse for what he had done. He didn't care about his own sister at all. In the same year, their mother passed away after a prolonged illness, but even then, Tony did not seem to have any strong feelings. It appeared that his own family did not matter to him at all. The worst part is that none of this can be blamed on drug addiction. He had been humiliating and abusing Gemma since childhood, so there is no justification for what he did. Tony's brother and father are forced to live the rest of their lives with the realization of what kind of monster Tony really is. Riley Crossman was born on December 22, 2003, in the small American town of Martinsburg, West Virginia. Her parents divorced when she was young, and the girl moved with her mother and younger sister to Berkeley Springs, a town 40 kilometers from Martinsburg. After a while, her mother began dating another man, and they had 2 more children. However, Riley maintained a close relationship with her father and regularly went to visit him. The girl attended Berkeley Springs High School and took dance and singing lessons. She also had a boyfriend named Hayden Lacey. According to her parents, there was a great relationship between them. Riley was happy. She and her boyfriend even had a joint Instagram account where they posted pictures together. Her mom, Chantel Oakley, worked 2 jobs. On May 7, 2019, she took off early from her morning shift because she wasn't feeling well. When she arrived home, she texted Riley that she was going to sleep in before her evening shift and asked her to wake her up when the girl returned from school. Riley came home at about 3:30 p.m., woke up her mother, and went to her room. Chantel's roommate's mother was also in the house with her that day, effectively replacing her grandmother and looking after the younger children. Chantel returned from work at about 10 p.m. As she walked past her daughter's room, she saw that her door was closed, but the light was on behind her. Her mother thought Riley was getting ready for bed and went to bed herself almost immediately. She was still not feeling well and wanted to get a good night's sleep before her morning shift. The next day, at about 7:15 a.m., Chantel peeked into her daughter's room before she left for work, but Riley wasn't there. She didn't see anything suspicious about that, though. School started at 7:45, and the girl could have gone there already. Riley's school was only a short walk away, so she got there on her own. About halfway through the day, her mother got a call from the school saying that Riley had missed some classes. This alarmed Chantel slightly, but she still didn't see it as a major concern. Her daughter could have just skipped a few classes and gone out with friends. At about 3:30 p.m., Riley's grandmother began to worry. The girl should have been home by now, but still wasn't. Then she contacted Chantel, at which point her mother already suspected something was wrong. Riley was always calling or texting her to take time off to go out with friends after school, but that day she didn't get a single message from her daughter. Her mother had sent her several messages, and they had all failed to reach their destination. Then she tried calling her, but each time it went to voicemail. This indicated that Riley's phone was either dead or had been turned off for some reason. Chantel also called Riley's own father, hoping that the girl might have gone to him. However, he too did not contact his daughter that day. The mother asked her grandmother to go to the school and look for Riley there. The grandmother went there, but she was unable to locate the girl. None of the teachers knew where she could be either. Around 5 p.m., Chantel decided to take a day off from work and drove to the school, but she couldn't find her daughter either. She spotted her boyfriend in the parking lot and asked if he had seen Riley, but Hayden stated that he had spent the day on an out-of-town trip and had not even contacted her. Together, they went around the school grounds, looking in and around the building itself, but the girl was nowhere to be found. After a while, her mother decided to go home, hoping that Riley might have returned there. Alas, she was not there either. After waiting some more time, she decided to go to the police. By then, the girl's father had arrived in Berkeley Springs and went in search of his daughter. He drove around the small town asking people he met if they had seen Riley. With a population of just over 600, most of the residents knew each other. One of the local teenagers said he saw her walking down the street. Unfortunately, this information did nothing to help him find Riley, and investigators thought the boy was just mistaken. The police quickly began a search, interviewing everyone the girl knew. None of her friends had seen Riley that day, nor had she shown up at school. At the same time, several teachers noted that she was present in their classes. This misled the detectives at first, but it soon became clear. These teachers had simply failed to notice the girl's absence and flagged her down. From conversations with Riley's acquaintances, the police began to reconstruct the chronology of events. They found out that on the evening of May 7th, the girl was on the phone with her boyfriend until 10:30 p.m., and she answered her friend's messages on social media until midnight. What follows is something very strange. At 5:40 a.m., Riley called her boyfriend by video link, but he was asleep at the time and didn't answer. The detectives immediately suspected something was wrong. Why was Riley trying to contact him at such an early hour? The girl's mother assured her that Riley would never run away from home. She simply had no reason to. Given that she was the eldest child in the family, her mother treated her very gently, almost never forbade her to go out with friends or a boyfriend, allowed her to go to her father's house in another town at any time, and generally did not control her every move. The only thing was that Riley always informed her of her plans and asked permission. Considering that the girl was only 15 years old at the time of her disappearance, she had no driver's license, so she also could not leave town on her own in a car. This once again indicated that the version of an escape seemed unlikely. Instead, the detectives considered kidnapping as the most likely theory. The same evening Riley's mother contacted law enforcement, they began a search for the girl. Police officers searched the school and the surrounding area and combed the town. They were quickly joined by community volunteers who cared about Riley. As is usually the case, these small-town residents thought nothing like this could happen to them. Soon, the police decided to search Riley's bedroom, and there they found the first grisly piece of evidence. On a pillow and sheets, they found small blood stains. They sent the items immediately to a lab, where experts ran a DNA test and determined that the blood belonged to Riley. At this point, everyone realized that something truly terrible had happened to the girl. If her family had hoped to the last that Riley had gone somewhere on her own initiative, after the discovery of the blood, those hopes were dashed. Here, it's worth clarifying why the mother didn't notice traces of blood when she examined her daughter's bedroom a few hours earlier. The bed was made, and it had not occurred to her to lift the blanket. This finding not only indicated that the girl had most likely been attacked, it had all happened in her house, and it was up to the police to figure out who might have done it. After the blood trail was discovered, the search escalated. In the days that followed, more volunteers joined the police. Dozens of people also provided various equipment that might come in handy when surveying the area. At one point, detectives even had to ask the public to stop carrying the equipment because there was already an excess of it. In addition, the police repeatedly gave press conferences to get the story out to the general public. There is always a chance that someone might have noticed something strange, heard suspicious conversations, or stumbled upon potential evidence. So it was important for the police to let everyone in the county know about Riley. After a while, the local police were joined by the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the state police. Together they continued to search for the missing girl, but with no results. On May 15th, law enforcement decided to bring in additional forces and organized a large-scale search covering a wide area of many kilometers around the city. The next morning, they announced that they had managed to find Riley Crossman's body. It was about a 40-minute drive from Berkeley Springs, near a country road near the top of a small mountain. The detectives knew immediately that they were dealing with a murder, not an accident. It looked as if the unknown perpetrator was trying to hide the body as far away from prying eyes as possible. Medical examiners examined the body and confirmed that it was indeed Riley, but they couldn't determine the cause of death because of the extensive decomposition. It was very strange because it had been just over a week since the girl had disappeared. Apparently, the killer had done something to the body. Investigators noticed several other strange things. First, the girl was wearing only one shoe, and they could not find a second shoe anywhere nearby. Secondly, they concluded that the unknown perpetrator changed her clothes because they had information that the girl was supposed to be wearing leggings and a sweatshirt, while when they found her, she was wearing shorts. They also found traces of whitewash or plaster on her clothing. The police reclassified the case as a homicide, and now they had to find the perpetrator. They re-interviewed all of Riley's relatives and acquaintances and noticed something odd. The testimony of Andy McCauley, Chantel's roommate, did not match the story of another man Andy worked with at a construction site in nearby Hedgesville. He initially told police that on May 8th, Riley's birthday, he did not leave his workplace from morning until late afternoon. However, that same day, around 10 a.m., his neighbor noticed a green Dodge pickup truck in front of their house. The neighbor knew that this car did not belong to either Andy or Chantel. Moreover, Andy's driver's license had been temporarily revoked. With all this in mind, the neighbor asked Chantel what this car was doing in front of their house, but the woman was unaware. After the whole town became aware of Riley's disappearance, the neighbor decided to share the observation with the police. Detectives questioned Andy again. They determined that the vehicle in question belonged to one of his co-workers, and the man had not driven it before. The owner of the pickup truck often picked Andy up in the mornings to drive him to work. Upon learning that the police were aware of his movements that day, Andy changed his statement. He stated that he had actually taken the pickup truck and drove it to buy illegal substances to take with a co-worker at the construction site later in the day. Sometime later, he changed his statement again and said that he went to his house to pick up the substances and then returned to work. All of this already looked very strange, but the detectives had even more creepy discoveries waiting for them next. For starters, they talked to Riley's mother and asked her to recall if she had noticed any oddities in her roommate's behavior. Then she told them that on May 8th, the day her daughter disappeared, Andy had indeed been acting suspiciously. When he returned home that night, Chantel told him about Riley's disappearance. The man immediately said he would go looking for her, got on his bicycle, and rode off. However, when the woman returned home from her search, she found Andy asleep on the couch as if nothing had happened. This behavior was very strange. All of Riley's relatives had been combing the streets until late at night, helped by concerned townspeople, while Andy simply went to sleep as if nothing had happened. In addition, one day after the girl went missing, Chantel called Andy and recorded the conversation. Unfortunately, its full content was not disclosed. All we know is that Chantel was already suspicious of Andy at this point and linked it all to his addiction to illegal substances. The police then spoke to Andy's co-worker and found out that, in fact, the men had been absent from work from about 9 a.m. until about 2 p.m. In addition, the coworker stated that he believed that Andy had banned substances with him to begin with, so there was no reason for him to go somewhere to get them. The detectives then searched for the green Dodge and found a large stain of dried plaster in the trunk. Forensics showed that it was the same substance found on Riley's clothing. Investigators also led service dogs to the pickup, which detected a deadly smell in the trunk. They also found some pretty specific bolts in the car, which are rarely used. 2 of the exact same bolts were found near Riley's body. The police soon found another inconsistency in Andy's statement. They examined camera footage from nearby communities and found that on May 8, the man was only a few miles from where Riley's body would later be found. He was caught on gas station store cameras and on several traffic cameras. It was all very strange. Andy didn't have a driver's license, was usually picked up by other people, and got around on his bike. But this day, for some reason, he took someone else's car and drove it around for half a day on unfamiliar routes. Another coworker told police that on May 8, Andy asked him for 3 construction bags. Detectives were also approached by Andy's former coworker, who told an even creepier story. He said that he and Andy had never gotten along, but between about 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. on May 8th, Andy called him dozens of times and also sent a whole bunch of messages. He was in a panic and said he needed to hide with someone right away. Andy explained that he was in possession of illegal substances and was afraid of being caught. This former colleague did not let him in that night, but later reported the story to the police. In his defense, the man stated that he had taken illegal substances that night, after which he noticed a police car parked not far from his house and panicked. Except the police department checked this information and found that none of their cars were in that area. This meant that Andy's story was a common lie. All of the above was enough for the police to arrest Andy the day after the body was found and charge him with murder. The man denied guilt, so the case went to trial. The case then stalled for more than 2 years as the trial did not begin until September 27, 2021. This was due to the coronavirus and the limitations associated with it, as well as the peculiarities of the U.S. court system, where such delays are the norm. Nevertheless, even more gruesome details of the case emerged during the course of the trial. For starters, Chantel, in her speech, provided one disturbing detail about the evening of May 7th. That afternoon, she returned from work at 10 p.m., and Andy was asleep on the couch. When she entered the room, the man immediately woke up. When she saw his eyes, Chantel immediately thought he had taken illegal substances. Andy had used powerful drugs before and even had a criminal record for possession, of which the woman was well aware. Further, the prosecution revealed information about disturbing messages sent from Riley's phone shortly before her disappearance. At 11 p.m. on May 7th, the girl texted her boyfriend that Andy had just gone into her room. 12 minutes later, she sent another text where she wrote that she was scared. She never contacted him again. Unfortunately, Hayden had already gone to bed at that time and did not see these messages. By morning, they had already been deleted. At trial, he also said that Andy had repeatedly entered Riley's room that night. The girl was video chatting with her boyfriend, and Hayden could hear him enter the room. Andy asked her to do the dishes and talked about some other mundane things, but Riley was unequivocally afraid of him. She asked Guy not to pass out while Andy was in her room. It also came out at trial that Andy had called Riley several times around 3 a.m., but she wouldn't pick up the phone, and on the third time, she blocked his number altogether. The whole thing was very creepy and incomprehensible. According to the prosecution's version, Andy made these calls to see if Riley was communicating with her boyfriend at the time. Later, the records of these calls were deleted from both phones, but the cell phone provider still had them. Despite all this, the prosecution had no evidence to indicate what had happened that night. They speculated that Andy killed Riley late that night, waited until morning, and drove to work. He then borrowed a coworker's car, drove to the house, picked up the body, and took it to a secluded spot. He then cleared the message and call history from her phone and got rid of it. It also emerged at trial that Chantel and Andy's own mother not only knew about his addiction to illegal substances, they also knew that under their influence, the man was becoming aggressive and dangerous. The final court hearing was held on October 5, 2021. Despite the fact that all available evidence was circumstantial and did not connect Andy directly to the murder, the jury reached a guilty verdict. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Further consideration was given to the possibility of parole. Andy's attorneys asked to give their client the option after 15 years, but the judge ultimately ruled for life without the possibility of parole. As the judge pronounced the sentence, Andy showed no emotion. He also seemed detached and uninterested at previous hearings. Apparently, he had resigned himself to the inevitable. But what about motive? Because of the degree of decomposition, the experts could not establish whether Riley had been abused. This, however, is the most obvious option. Even though the court could not prove it, this story was widely covered in the American media, and people's opinions were divided. Some put part of the blame on the girl's mother, who brought a convicted drug addict into her home and built a family with him. At the trial, she assured them that it had never even occurred to her that Andy might harm her children. Others defended the mother, believing that she could not have foreseen such an outcome. She worked 2 jobs most of the time to feed her family, and perhaps she didn't even have time to think about her decisions might affect her children. What remains unclear is the moment of that 5:30 a.m. video call made from Riley Hayden's phone. Was the girl still alive at that moment? Or did Andy make the call to throw off the investigation later? Jennifer Hallen was born on February 23, 1988, in a small American village called Wimberley, Texas. She had loving parents, a sister named Diana, and a carefree, peaceful childhood. Soon, her family moved to a city called Bryan, which was about 200 kilometers from her native village. After finishing school, the young woman entered a local college called Blinn College, where she planned to study to become a legal assistant and hoped to connect her future life with jurisprudence. She had many friends who spoke of her as a kind, hard-working, and friendly young woman. She always looked at life positively and looked forward to her future career. Jenna settled near her college, renting an apartment in Autumn Woods Apartments. She also got a job as a waitress in a local restaurant to cover her housing expenses and not rely on her parents financially. Despite a busy schedule in which she had to combine studying and working, Jenna often spent time with her boyfriend, Spencer Hood. They had been dating since high school but lived separately. Even after Jenna moved into a rented apartment, their relationship had been going on for several years, although the couple argued periodically. On April 8, 2008, Jenna, who was 20 years old at the time, finished her shift and at around 9 p.m. headed home. Since Spencer studied with her at the same college and lived nearby, Jenna invited him over to help each other with their homework. At around midnight, Spencer said goodbye to Jenna and went home. About half an hour after that, they briefly talked on the phone, after which they wished each other good night and went to sleep. On the morning of April 9th, Spencer discovered that he had left his textbook at Jenna's place, which he needed for a lecture. Around 11:30 a.m., he went to her house to retrieve it. When no one answered the door, Spencer was surprised to find that it was unlocked. Thinking that Jenna was still asleep, he walked into her apartment and headed to her bedroom. However, he was met with a horrifying sight. Jenna was lying lifeless on the floor. Realizing that she was dead, Spencer immediately ran to the neighboring apartment and asked the residents to call the police. The recording of this call is publicly available. Jenna's neighbor informed the operator that she was lying on the floor not breathing, and Spencer's shocked voice could be heard in the background. The arriving police officers examined the apartment and found no signs of forced entry. The only strange thing was that the window in the second bedroom was open. Detectives immediately speculated that the killer may have entered the premises through it, but this theory was questioned due to the unlocked door. Investigators immediately doubted the theory of a possible robbery, which could have led the perpetrator to attack Jenna, as all her things were in their place. Nothing valuable was missing, and her purse with money and credit cards was hanging right by the front door, which a thief would have undoubtedly taken. Furthermore, there was complete order in the apartment. No signs of struggle were observed. At first glance, there was no evidence pointing to the killer's recent presence. Examining Jenna's body, the police did not notice any serious injuries, except for a bruise on her forehead and a bitten lip. She was lying on her back, fully dressed, and the position of her body looked entirely natural. Small blood droplets were visible on her shirt collar and on the carpet near her body. After studying the body, medical experts made several important conclusions. Firstly, death occurred about 10 hours before Spencer found Jenna, meaning she was killed just an hour after she finished talking to him on the phone. Secondly, traces of strangulation were found on her body, which was the cause of death. The experts also determined that the unknown perpetrator did not sexually assault the young woman. However, Jenna tried to fight him off, as evidenced by skin and blood under her fingernails. All of these samples were immediately sent to the laboratory to try to extract a DNA sample of the perpetrator. Of course, her boyfriend, Spencer, became the first suspect for several reasons. Firstly, statistically speaking, murders often turn out to be someone close to the victim. Secondly, the absence of any signs of forced entry indicated that Jenna may have known the perpetrator and willingly let them into the apartment. During questioning, Spencer cooperated with the investigation and answered all questions. At that time, however, experts had not yet managed to extract a DNA sample from the killer. Therefore, the police could not verify Spencer's involvement in the murder. Eventually, he was released, but investigators did not rush to clear him of suspicion. Meanwhile, Jenna's friends said that he cherished her deeply and was unlikely to have caused any harm to his beloved. Next, detectives began searching for possible witnesses. The police questioned Jenna's neighbors to find out if they had noticed anything suspicious on the night of the murder. They soon found several guys who were playing volleyball near Jenna's apartment complex at that time. They reported seeing a strange guy who came out of the building near the young woman's apartment. They were surprised that this person was only wearing pants. The witnesses added that the guy looked like 26 years old, Sean Stevens, who lived in the same apartment complex. Upon learning of this, Jenna's friends told the police about another troubling fact. Some time ago, Stevens, who lived right across from Jenna, shouted insults at her from his window. It was not entirely clear what was behind his behavior, but for the police, all of these facts were enough to suspect the young man. Stevens was found and questioned. He claimed to know nothing about the murder and that he did not leave his apartment complex that night, let alone walk around without clothes. The police had no way to confirm his words, but without any serious evidence, he had to be released as well. In addition to everything else, the detectives studied the possible connection of this murder to Jenna's workplace. However, her colleagues from the restaurant and the surveillance cameras showed that on the day of her death, she did not have any conflicts with anyone, and such situations had never arisen before. From this point on, the investigation slowed down. The police continued to search for new leads, questioning Jenna's relatives and friends, and at some point, they were able to get a new lead. During a conversation with investigators, the young woman's parents were able to recall important information that could potentially point to another suspect. 2 months before Jenna's murder, she complained to her relatives about a repairman who was doing maintenance work in her apartment complex building. One day, when she came out of the shower in just a towel, she discovered a stranger in her living room. When she asked him what he was doing in her apartment, he replied that he thought no one was home. The man claimed that he did not hear the running shower and stayed to check the condition of the apartment and make sure nothing needed repair. Of course, Jenna was shocked by such a situation. She found out that the man was 29-year-old Jeremiah Rosser and reported the incident to the building manager. The police conducted a small experiment. One person stood at the entrance door and the other turned down the shower. The sound of running water was very well heard in the living room and even near the entrance door. In such a situation, it was highly unlikely that Rosser did not hear it and thought that no one was home. After talking to the building manager, the police found out that Rosser stopped coming to work a few days after Jenna's murder. This was the reason for his dismissal. All of this looked very suspicious, and the detectives tried to find the man. But here they faced one problem. Rosser moved out of his apartment, and they could not determine his current location. The police only managed to find out that he has an ex-wife and 2 children. Thus, in this complicated case, there were 3 main suspects: Spencer Hood, Sean Stevens, and Jeremiah Rosser. To determine if one of them was the killer, they had to wait for the results from the lab, where experts were trying to extract a DNA sample. They were working on studying the particles under the young woman's nails and drops of blood on her shirt and rug. As a result, they found out that one of the drops of blood on the rug contained genetic material that did not belong to Jenna. This sample matched the one extracted from the particles under the young woman's nails. In the end, the experts were finally able to extract a full DNA sample. The first thing they did was enter it into the FBI database, but there were no matches. This meant that the killer had not previously been convicted of any serious crimes. Despite this, the police were now able to match the obtained sample with DNA samples from 3 main suspects. The problem was only that their samples were not taken during the initial interrogations. Detectives tried to contact them and were surprised to find out that all 3 had left town and their current location was unknown. The police immediately began searching for them. Meanwhile, investigators decided not to sit idly by and use the killer's DNA sample. They began voluntarily collecting DNA samples from men who lived in the same complex as Jenna and worked in her restaurant. In total, they managed to obtain 50 DNA samples, but none of them matched the one found at the murder scene. Meanwhile, the police finally managed to find Spencer, who turned out to be 3 hours' drive from Brian at his parents' house. The young man explained that he could not cope with Jenna's death and decided to spend time with his family to distract himself from this tragedy. He voluntarily provided his DNA sample, which was immediately sent to the laboratory. The young man also allowed experts to examine his body for scratches that would undoubtedly be on the killer. After all, his piece of skin were found under Jenna's nails. Following this, the police managed to establish Stephen's location, who also went to visit his parents, who lived 720 kilometers from Blinn College. He voluntarily provided his DNA sample, which was also sent to the laboratory. While the police were waiting for the results from the laboratory, they had to find the last suspect. This turned out to be much more difficult. The police managed to contact Rosser's ex-wife, who shared some troubling facts. According to her, When their marriage was nearing divorce, Rosser was behaving aggressively towards her. He raised his hand to her, knocked her down, and tried to strangle her. In addition, he often caused scandals, which made it impossible to live with him, and the marriage ended in divorce. All of this happened around the same time that Jenna was killed. Thanks to his ex-wife, the police were able to locate Rosser. This happened in early October, 7 months after the murder. During the interrogation, he behaved quite calmly, answering all the detectives' questions. Additionally, the man had never been arrested in his life. He denied his involvement in the murder and voluntarily provided his DNA sample. The police also searched his car and found some interesting discoveries. A laptop was found in the car, whose serial number was listed in the theft report. A few months before Jenna's murder, her neighbor contacted the police after her laptop disappeared from her apartment. But that wasn't the worst part. The police also found keys to several apartments in the residential complex where he worked. Considering that he was fired a week after Jenna's murder, Rosser had no right to keep the keys, and the manager was obliged to confiscate them. All of this indicated that the man was engaged in petty theft. But could he move on to cold-blooded murder? Meanwhile, experts from the laboratory tested all 3 DNA samples. It turned out that Jenna's boyfriend and her neighbor had nothing to do with the murder. But Rosser's DNA sample matched the sample found under the victim's nails. Upon receiving the results, the police immediately arrested Rosser, but despite the DNA match, he continued to insist on his innocence. Of course, this did not help him in any way, and the man was charged with Jenna's murder. Since Rosser was not eager to disclose the details of that night, the investigators came up with their own version of what happened. Apparently, Rosser broke into Jenna's apartment with the intention of committing robbery, using a key to her door. This could have happened in the evening before 9 p.m. when the young woman had not yet returned home from work. Perhaps Rosser did not have time to commit the intended crime because Jenna came home with her boyfriend, and the criminal had to hide in the second bedroom, where he waited for Spencer to leave. It is possible that it was Rosser who opened the window, hoping to quietly leave the apartment through it, but it did not work out for him. After waiting for Spencer to leave and hearing Jenna wishing him good night over the phone, Rosser could finally try to leave the apartment through the front door. There are 2 possible scenarios for what happened next. Either he tried to leave the apartment, but Jenna noticed him first and in a panic, he attacked her, or he intentionally went to her room planning to commit murder. The police even suggested that he killed the young woman because she resembled his ex-wife. Considering that the man refused to admit his guilt, the case was taken to court. The wait for the trial to begin dragged on for many months, as is often the case in the state's legal system. However, just 2 weeks before the trial was set to begin, something unexpected happened. In December 2009, more than a year after his arrest, Rosser finally admitted his guilt. He entered into a plea agreement with the prosecutor in the hope of reducing his sentence. The man also asked the investigation not to involve his family in the legal process. His parents and 2 children from his ex-wife were among them. Thanks to this, the trial was completed in record time. If he had not admitted guilt, the trial could easily have dragged on for several years, despite the DNA sample match. As a result, Rosser was sentenced to 55 years in prison. In addition, he received 5 years in prison for the theft of a laptop. The assistant district attorney said that, to his memory, this was the maximum sentence in the case of a guilty plea. However, Rosser had a much more serious risk, the death penalty. If the investigation had been able to prove that the murder was premeditated and planned, Rosser could have received this sentence. The man was placed in Rasharon Prison in Texas. He will be eligible for parole only in 2036. Given that Rosser was 27 at the time of the crime, he may be released early at the age of 55. However, if he serves his full sentence, he will only be released at the age of 82. During the trial, he refused to look his relatives and friends of Jenna in the eye. He was led into the courtroom in an orange prison jumpsuit, handcuffed. The man only nodded to his parents in greeting when he saw them in the courtroom. Otherwise, he remained silent and unresponsive with his head bowed. The victim's family had the right to speak in court, addressing the murderer directly. All three of them took advantage of this opportunity. Diana's sister stood in the court 60 centimeters away from the perpetrator, saying she hoped Rosser would come to realize the terrible act he had committed. She promised to pray for him and believed that she would someday be able to forgive her sister's killer. Jenna's mother expressed doubt that Rosser regretted his actions. She made the killer look her straight in the eye and said with firm conviction that he would never be able to fully understand the horror he had inflicted on their family. The father of Jenna did not plan to speak at the trial, but changed his mind at the last moment. He promised to come to any prison where Rosser is placed and tell everyone what a monster he is. He also expressed willingness to attend the hearing in 27 years when Rosser requests parole. In addition, Jenna's parents filed a lawsuit against the owner of the residential complex. They were sure that their daughter's words were not taken seriously when she complained to Rosser's supervisor about his behavior. Moreover, Rosser's keys were not confiscated after his dismissal, indicating the manager's negligence. Jenna's parents believed that their daughter would still be alive if her complaints had been taken seriously and attention had been paid to Rosser's inappropriate behavior. The only thing that remains unclear to this day is Rosser's exact motives. Despite confessing to the murder, he refused to reveal the reasons for his actions. In any case, it doesn't matter anymore. His guilt is evident, and he deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. Sherry Rasmussen was born on February 7, 1957, in the state of Washington. She grew up in a large and friendly family with 2 sisters and loving parents. Later, they moved to the city of Tucson, Arizona, where Sherry attended the local school. She was an excellent student and even finished elementary school a year ahead of her peers. Sherry completed the entire 7th grade program on summer vacation by herself. After graduating from high school in 1973, she enrolled in a California college where her older sister was already studying. In her first year, Sherry decided to pursue a medical education and become a nurse, for which she had to take additional courses at another institution. After graduating from college in 1975, Sherry decided to get a master's degree at the University of California, Los Angeles, and also worked there as a nurse to pay for her education. After receiving her master's degree at the age of 23, her father bought her an apartment in the suburbs of Los Angeles. But Sherry did not want to live off her parents, so she wrote her father a check every month for the entire amount of the mortgage payments. She also got a job at a local hospital, heading the nursing department for caring for seriously ill people. In May 1984, when Sherry was 27 years old, she met a man named John Rutan. They immediately hit it off and the couple started dating. John had a good education, worked as a computer engineer, and was a very intelligent young man. A year later, the couple decided to get married, and after that, John moved into Sherry's apartment. The newlyweds spent their honeymoon in Jamaica, after which they returned home to celebrate Christmas with Sherry's family. It seemed that this couple was destined for a happy and carefree future. On February 24th of the following year, when John was getting ready for work as usual, Sherry complained of feeling unwell and decided to stay home. She asked John to call her in a few hours. At around 7:20 a.m., John left for work. Closer to 10 a.m., John tried to reach her by phone, but she didn't answer. Half an hour later, he tried again, but still no answer. So he called her workplace to check if she had gone to work, but Sherry hadn't shown up at the hospital either. Her sister also tried to reach her, but without success. John returned home from work at around 6 p.m. and immediately noticed something strange. The garage door was open, even though he had closed it in the morning, and Sherry's car was missing. Therefore, he first thought that she had gone somewhere. As he approached the garage, he saw a lot of broken glass and immediately discovered its source. There was a small balcony above the garage with a glass door which had been smashed. He entered the house through the garage and, to his horror, found Sherry there. She was lying on the floor, her body badly disfigured. John immediately called the police and detectives began to examine the crime scene. In all the rooms, there was complete chaos. Broken vases, overturned furniture, scattered items. A bloody handprint was found on the wall next to the alarm button. Apparently, the victim tried to reach it, but failed. In addition to extensive bruises and wounds, experts noticed a human bite mark on Sherry's wrist. Apart from all of the above, the marks on her hands indicated that the attacker tied up the victim before untying her. The cause of death was 3 close-range gunshot wounds. Detectives found a blanket with bullet holes in the apartment and concluded that the attacker wrapped the gun in it to muffle the sound of the shots. Detectives immediately concluded that there was a prolonged struggle between the attacker and Sherry. This was evidenced by the amount of scattered and broken items throughout the apartment, as well as a bloody mark next to the alarm button. The lead investigator quickly concluded that they were dealing with a failed robbery. According to his opinion, at least 2 criminals broke into Sherry's apartment, but they didn't expect her to be home. A struggle ensued between them and Sherry fought for her life until the end. Several facts supported the robbery version. Firstly, Sherry's car disappeared from the garage. Secondly, someone had placed the stereo equipment and player next to the staircase leading to the second floor. According to the police, the robbers wanted to take them and leave, but after the scuffle and murder, they fled the scene. However, there were some dubious moments in this version. Firstly, the police did not find any signs of forced entry. This meant that either Sherry let the criminals in herself or they had a key. Secondly, the perpetrators did not touch absolutely all the valuable items, including the jewelry box standing in plain sight. Detectives interviewed all of Sherry's neighbors, but it didn't yield any new leads. Some residents heard the sounds of a struggle, but not gunshots. They also didn't see anyone entering the woman's apartment. Experts took blood samples and fingerprints from the house, but they couldn't conduct DNA analysis in 1985. The lead investigator also took a piece of cotton and soaked it in the trace of the bite on Sherry's body. He hoped that the attacker's saliva could be left behind, and eventually, experts could use this clue to catch the killer. After a thorough search of the apartment, detectives learned one interesting fact. It turned out that the criminals took only one thing: Sherry and John's marriage certificate. This was very strange and also raised suspicions about the man himself, but his alibi was unquestionable. John was at work until the evening, and he simply couldn't have committed this crime. Moreover, he himself told the police about the disappearance of this document. Detectives were unable to find an explanation for this strange fact. After a week and a half, they found Sherry's car in a parking lot 4 kilometers from her apartment. It was unlocked and the keys were in the ignition. Forensic experts tried to find fingerprints, but they were unsuccessful. Either the criminals only touched it with gloves on, or they wiped away all the fingerprints. 2 months after the murder that took place just a few hundred meters from Sherry's home, a robbery occurred. Detectives immediately found many similarities. 2 criminals broke into a stranger's apartment through the garage, threatened the owner with a gun, and stole stereo equipment. The lead investigator immediately thought that these two were behind the woman's murder, so the police tried to find them. From witness accounts, they created approximate composite sketches of the suspects and also learned that both men were Latino, but they were never found. However, investigators did not show much interest in getting to the truth, which constantly irritated Sherry's parents. Her father regularly went to the police station, inquired about the progress of the investigation, and asked the detectives to consider different versions. Once he even asked them to take a closer look at John's ex-girlfriend, Stephanie Lazarus, who was a police officer herself. Sherry had told her father several times that she was obsessed with John, but the investigators only laughed at this version. They told him to watch fewer detective shows. The thing was that Stephanie couldn't accept John's departure. Learning that he was going to marry another woman, she came to Sherry's workplace. Stephanie told her that their marriage was doomed and that she and John would be together again sooner or later. In addition, she said that John had slept with her already after becoming engaged to Sherry. Of course, after this visit, Sherry was deeply upset. Upon returning home, she told John what had happened, and he admitted that he had indeed slept with Stephanie. After she found out about his engagement, the young woman begged him to come over, spoke of her love, and urged him to return to her. But he said he loved Sherry and intended to marry her. Then Stephanie offered to sleep with him one last time, and John agreed. He apologized to Sherry and said it was a huge mistake on his part. The woman forgave him, and this incident with Stephanie gradually faded away. But the story didn't end there. Stephanie came to their home several times without warning under various pretexts. Once she came with a set of skis and announced that John promised to wax them for her. The next time she entered their apartment when the man was not at home. Sherry did not even hear how she entered the room and was shocked to see Stephanie in her living room. When asked what she was doing there, the woman said she came to talk to John. Sherry had a hard time convincing her to leave. Later, she even thought of going to the police about this incident, but did not. The woman was afraid that if she told about the harassment by their own employee, they would just laugh at her. She also wondered how Stephanie managed to enter the residential complex. It was surrounded by a high fence, and a special pass was required to enter. Apparently, the woman used her police badge, and the security let her in. As for Stephanie's apartment, there had to be a duplicate key. Otherwise, she simply could not have entered without breaking the lock. In addition to this, Sherry repeatedly noticed that someone was following her. Once, she and John were sitting in a restaurant, and the woman saw someone staring at them intently. As soon as she looked at this person, he immediately left. Sherry did not see his face because it was covered with a hood. Unknown calls also regularly came to their home phone, and Sherry suspected it could be Stephanie. The victim's father told detectives about all these incidents, but they did not attach any importance to his words. They were sure that the murder was committed by the two Mexicans who robbed an apartment near Sherry's home. 3 months after the murder, something interesting happened. Some documents from Sherry's case disappeared from the police station. Among them were records of detectives about the progress of the investigation. They had to record almost every step related to the investigation of this crime. But at one point, the police simply could not find these journals. However, there were no important leads there anyway. Since then, the case has been hanging for years. Detectives did not show much desire to look for new leads, despite constant pressure from Sherry's parents. 8 months after the murder, Sherry's father offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help find the perpetrator. A year later, he held a press conference where he again promised a reward for information, but in both cases, it yielded no results. 7 years later, the lead investigator on the case retired. The victim's father decided to meet with his successor, hoping that he would take his job more seriously. Additionally, it was 1993 and DNA analysis technology was already being actively used by the police to solve crimes. Sherry's father asked the detective to perform such an analysis and even offered to fully pay for it. However, the detective stated that it was pointless since they did not have a single suspect with whom to compare the obtained DNA profile. Meanwhile, John started a new family, but at some point, he reunited with Stephanie. They planned to go to Hawaii together, but something unusual happened before that. The man called the detective and asked if they had any new evidence indicating Stephanie's involvement in the murder. Apparently, he himself suspected that the woman might have done something like that. However, all these years, he was afraid to talk about it, although this did not prevent him from sleeping with her again. As for Stephanie herself, she was quickly climbing the career ladder in the police department. She received higher ranks, twice became Detective of the Year, and had an impeccable reputation. She also married another police officer, but this did not prevent her from regularly sleeping with John. In 2001, a separate unit was formed in Los Angeles to work on unsolved murders. They were given Sherry's case along with thousands of similar cases, and the detectives began sorting through them gradually. They briefly studied each case, trying to understand which ones had the greatest chance of being solved. For example, murders without any clues were pushed to the end of the queue, and cases with DNA samples of possible suspects were marked as the most promising. Sherry's murder made it onto this list because among the evidence was a piece of cotton that could have contained the perpetrator's saliva, left behind after a bite. 2 years later, detectives picked up the case and sent all available evidence to the laboratory. Due to high demand, they had to wait almost 2 years for the results until January 2005. Among the evidence were nail fragments and blood samples from the apartment. All of them contained only Sherry's DNA, and the forensic scientists only had to study the sample from the bite mark on her body. Problem was that they couldn't find the vial with this evidence for a whole day until they finally discovered it by the wall of a large refrigerator. After studying the sample, experts found foreign DNA belonging to an unknown woman. This profile was immediately run through the FBI database, but it wasn't there. Detectives speculated that this woman could have committed the robbery with another criminal, or 2 female robbers could have broken into Sherry's apartment. The investigators still believed that the murder occurred during a robbery. Therefore, they didn't consider any other versions. After they failed to find any new leads in this direction, the case was put on hold. This continued until February 2009, when a new detective took up Sherry's case and began studying the materials left by other investigators. Seeing that DNA from another woman was found at the bite mark on the victim's body, he questioned the robbery version. Detectives considered that the motives for this crime could be completely different, so they decided to compile a list of all the women who could potentially be related to Sherry's murder. As a result, they managed to collect 5 names. Among them was Stephanie, the victim's colleague at work, and 3 other young women. The detectives initially doubted Stephanie's involvement, considering her reputation and successful career in the police. For this reason, he first decided to check the other suspects. Together with other investigators, they fairly quickly concluded that 3 women from this list had no connection to Sherry's death. They lacked motives and had alibis. After that, they began to investigate the nurse who worked with Sherry. The case file stated that they had rather tense relations, and the police secretly obtained a sample of her DNA from the trash she threw away. Experts extracted the profile and found that it didn't match the saliva found at the bite mark location. Thus, the detectives had only one suspect left: Stephanie. He and several colleagues agreed to keep this information secret until they could obtain solid evidence or disprove this theory. None of them wanted to accuse a police officer with an impeccable reputation of murder, and Stephanie could easily ruin their careers using her connections. They began secretly gathering information on her, trying to find any connection to the murder. Interestingly, the woman worked in the same building on the same floor as them. Because of this, The investigators had to take many precautions and not even mention her name in their notes. Soon, the detectives discovered the first interesting fact. During the years of the murder, Stephanie owned a .38 caliber revolver, the same type of gun that was used to shoot Sherry. They also learned that the victim had repeatedly complained about strange and even aggressive behavior from Stephanie. The fact that the police officer came to Sherry's workplace in her uniform and said rude things to her seemed suspicious. Even more suspicion was added by the fact that Stephanie had broken into Sherry's gated community and even into her apartment several times. After analyzing the reports and photos from the crime scene, the detectives concluded that the possible robbery seemed staged. Nothing was taken from the apartment, not even the valuable items that were prominently displayed, but instead only a player and stereo were taken away. Moreover, the shooter had to be well versed in how the gun worked. In extreme conditions, he was able to wrap the gun barrel with a blanket in such a way that the neighbors did not hear a single shot. It is unlikely that a low-level thief of players could possess such skills, but a trained and experienced police officer could. Another fact indicating Stephanie's involvement was a stolen marriage registration certificate found in her apartment. Why would some random burglars look for this document and take it with them, leaving a whole box of jewelry behind? But for Stephanie, it could have had a significant symbolic value. Perhaps killing Sherry was not enough for her, or she had planned to break into her apartment only for this document, but the woman caught her in the act. In the end, the detective learned that 2 weeks after the murder, Stephanie came to the police station and filed a report of theft. According to this information, someone had broken into her car, which was left near the pier, and stolen several items, including a sports bag, clothes, videotapes, and a .38 caliber revolver. Given all the facts presented, the moment with the gun seemed very suspicious. Detectives suspected that she intentionally got rid of the weapon, disguising it as a theft. Furthermore, she filed a report at a different police station where nobody knew her, which seemed very strange since her colleagues would have taken the case with the utmost responsibility. As a result, the detectives decided to obtain a DNA sample from Stephanie. Several officers undercover followed her for a week until they finally had the opportunity to get it. On May 28, 2009, Stephanie and her stepdaughter stopped at a cafe for a snack. As soon as they left, the officers took the glass she drank from and sent it to the lab. The next day, the result was ready: a full match. Despite the many factors pointing to Stephanie's involvement, the detectives were still shocked. It was hard for them to believe that a high-ranking and respected police officer was connected to the murder, but the DNA results were indisputable. However, at that moment, they did not have time for these thoughts, and investigators began developing a plan to arrest her. None of them wanted to do this in the middle of the police station, in front of hundreds of officers. Moreover, Stephanie had extensive connections, and the detectives decided to lure her away from prying eyes. The chief of the Los Angeles Police Department was unofficially informed that one of his subordinates was suspected of the murder. The chief ordered the detectives not to approach Stephanie while she had her service or personal weapon with her. He also considered the idea of arresting her in her own home risky, since she lived with her husband and stepdaughter. The detectives began to think about how to get the person who outranked them to surrender their weapon. And soon they had an excellent idea. In the basement of the police department, there were holding cells designed for temporary detention of criminals. So anyone entering there had to surrender their weapon. To lure her there, a legend was created. Stephanie had extensive experience working in the department that dealt with art thefts. Therefore, on June 5, 2009, 2 detectives with hidden microphones approached her and asked for help. They said they had arrested a suspect who may have some information about stolen paintings. The detectives admitted that they were not familiar with all the details and needed the help of an experienced professional. Stephanie agreed and went with them to the basement where the suspect was supposed to be held. After the woman surrendered her weapon, they went to the interrogation room, but there was no suspect there. Instead, the detectives gradually and very carefully laid out the cards on the table, asking Stephanie questions about Sherry's murder. At first, they simply said that they needed to ask her a few questions about an old case related to her ex-boyfriend. Over the course of an hour, they smoothly led the dialogue to a discussion of the murder itself, but Stephanie said that she hardly remembered Sherry, as it was all a long time ago. Finally, the detectives announced that they had obtained the killer's DNA and asked Stephanie to provide her DNA sample for comparison. At that point, the woman immediately said that she was not going to give her DNA, refused to talk further without a lawyer, and decided to leave. The detectives let her go, but several policemen with handcuffs were waiting for Stephanie at the end of the corridor. 23 years after the murder, the woman was arrested. Considering Stephanie's vast police experience, all attempts to talk to her during interrogations led to no results. She knew the situation perfectly. There was DNA evidence against her found at the bite mark on the victim's body, and it was extremely difficult to dispute this evidence. Nevertheless, she denied her involvement and insisted on her innocence. As a result, the detectives had no choice but to prepare documents for the transfer to court. Over the next few years, Stephanie was held in a woman's prison until the first hearings began in 2012. It took the police 3 years to basically rebuild the case from scratch. Because their predecessors blindly believed in a failed robbery, it was necessary to redo all the materials and focus specifically on Stephanie. At the trial, the woman continued to insist on her innocence. Her lawyer questioned the DNA test results and also pointed out that there were no suspicions against Stephanie during the initial investigation. But all these arguments turned out to be completely unconvincing. The prosecution believed that on that day, Stephanie waited for John to leave for work and entered Sherry's apartment. She went upstairs, shot Sherry once, but Sherry managed to resist and a struggle ensued, which moved downstairs. Ultimately, Stephanie killed her, staged a riot in the apartment, creating an illusion of a burglary. She then found a marriage certificate and left the scene. After her arrest, detectives discovered that Stephanie had boasted to colleagues about her lock-picking set, and they found several books on how to pick locks in her home. This could explain how she entered the apartment without leaving any traces of a break-in. A lock of not the best quality can be picked with lockpicks so that no expert will notice any traces. The trial ended on March 8, 2012, and the jury found Stephanie guilty of murder. She received a sentence ranging from 27 years to life in prison, as well as an additional 2 years for using a service weapon. The judge deducted 1,000 days from her sentence, citing the time spent behind bars awaiting trial and her good behavior. Sherry's parents tried to sue the detectives who originally worked the case, despite the fact that the victim's father had been telling them to look at Stephanie from the very beginning. They ignored his words. This raises a reasonable question. Were they deliberately covering up their colleague, or did they really not believe in her involvement? In the first case, it would have been a serious crime, and in the second case, it would have been simple negligence and ignoring significant facts. Unfortunately, the statute of limitations had expired in this case, and the court refused to prosecute these police officers. As for Stephanie, she filed an appeal immediately after the trial, but it was quickly rejected. She still denies her guilt while behind bars. At present, she's 62 years old and can file a petition for early release only in 2039. Sherry's ex-husband, John, lost interest in investigating her murder. Almost immediately after it happened, he started a new family, slept with Stephanie for a while, and later moved to another city. Detectives questioned his involvement, but this version seems unlikely. Most likely, he did not know about his ex-wife's plans. Thus, this case could have been gathering dust in archives to this day if it hadn't fallen into the hands of professional detectives. Everyone who worked on it before refused to even consider the version of their colleagues' involvement. Amanda Lenke was born on June 7, 1991 in Tennessee. She grew up in a large and friendly family with several brothers and sisters. Later, they moved with their parents to Spring Hill, Florida, where Amanda attended the local middle school. She was passionate about dancing, writing poetry, playing multiple musical instruments, and was a very positive child. During school vacations, Amanda always went to her grandparents' house in a small town called White Cloud. She loved spending time there as she had many friends in the town. White Cloud was a quiet and peaceful place with a population of only 1,400 people. Most of its residents knew each other, children played without supervision, and no one worried about their safety. In 2004, when she was only 13 years old, Amanda finished the 7th grade of middle school and went to White Cloud for the whole summer. She spent a lot of time with her friends, went for walks, and enjoyed her vacation. On June 20th, Amanda stayed overnight at her best friend's house. They talked, had fun, and went to bed late at night. In the morning, her friend woke up and found that Amanda was not in the room. The bedroom windows were wide open. She went to the kitchen, walked around the house, but Amanda was nowhere to be found. It was strange because all her belongings, including clothes and a backpack, were left in the bedroom. The friend told her parents that Amanda was missing, and they called her grandparents. They walked several streets and called the parents of Amanda's other friends, but no one had seen her. Then the relatives decided to go to the police. They understood that Amanda could not have gone anywhere without warning, especially in just her pajamas. First, investigators talked to Amanda's friend. According to her, she didn't hear anything that night, and Amanda never told her that she was planning to leave. At the time of the disappearance, the friend's parents, as well as her brother and sister, were in the house. None of them heard or saw anything. Police tried to find witnesses who lived near the house, but they also hit a dead end. On that night, no residents noticed anything strange. On the first day of the investigation, the investigators concluded that the girl, with a high probability, had left home on her own initiative and run away. They argued that they found no signs of struggle in the house and that 5 people did not hear anything. It was difficult to imagine a scenario in which Amanda could have been abducted without waking up her friend who was sleeping just a meter away. This version caused outrage among Amanda's relatives. They insisted that the girl had no problems at home and was happy to spend the entire summer in White Cloud. In addition, they pointed out that the girl left all her things, including clothes, in her friend's room. According to the police's version, she decided to run away in just her pajamas. When the news of Amanda's disappearance spread throughout the district, the police received several calls from people saying they had seen a similar girl in different places. This only reinforced the detectives' confidence that Amanda had run away from home, but they could not confirm any of these leads. The investigators decided to check the girl's computer, hoping to find some information that could help in the search. They found correspondence with a certain young man, and based on this, the police assumed that Amanda ran away to meet him. However, there were discrepancies. There was no mention of a possible meeting in these correspondence, and it was about ordinary and everyday topics. Nevertheless, the investigators considered this enough to once again convince themselves of their correctness. At that time, they did not disclose all the details of the investigation, but information about correspondence with a certain guy spread throughout the city, so many local residents also began to think that the girl simply ran away from home. Meanwhile, her relatives were posting flyers and giving interviews to various media outlets. They insisted that Amanda could not have run away on her own initiative, and the police were not putting in all the effort to find her because of this misconception. The investigators did not really use the full range of their capabilities. If they officially considered this case as a kidnapping, they could have involved the FBI and other agencies in the investigation. Instead, they were convinced that the girl simply left home and, for this reason, searched for her half-heartedly. They never found any serious leads on Amanda's possible location, and the investigation stretched on for several weeks. On the morning of July 5th, mushroom pickers went to a forest located approximately 10 kilometers from White Cloud, where they found a human body and reported it to the police. Investigators arrived at the scene and immediately recognized the body as Amanda Lanke. She was wearing the same pajamas she had disappeared in from her friend's house. Later, medical experts officially confirmed her identity and determined that Amanda had received multiple blows from a heavy object and died on the night of her disappearance. Detectives concluded that the victim had been killed elsewhere and then brought to the forest. They could not find any significant leads, so they decided to interview everyone who knew the girl. Over the next few days, police questioned approximately 400 people, which constituted almost one-third of the entire population of White Cloud. Investigators even used a polygraph, but it did not yield any results. They also decided to take another look at the young man with whom Amanda had corresponded online. The problem was that the word killer was used in his nickname. Police considered the possibility that the victim actually went to meet him and he killed her. However, this version still had many inconsistencies. There was nothing to suggest that the girl would have gone to meet someone in her pajamas in the middle of the night. Furthermore, there was no hint of a personal meeting in their correspondence. The investigator could not identify this person, and soon the version of his involvement was no longer considered. In an attempt to get some new leads, detectives decided to study all of Amanda's belongings, which led to a breakthrough. They found her personal diary, which contained very disturbing information. Shortly before her death, Amanda wrote that a certain man had been harassing her, and the next several pages were torn out. Investigators suspected that his name was written on them. This diary immediately became the main lead in the case. Police tried to identify the man's identity. They talked to all of Amanda's friends and asked if the girl had mentioned anything about this. Several of her friends admitted that she had indeed told them about it and even named the man, Cecil Wallace. He was the stepfather of Amanda's friend with whom she had stayed the night. For detectives, this information was a real surprise. They had been looking for the killer all over the town and beyond, and in the end, the possible culprit was in the same house as the victim. But the testimony of the friends was not enough to arrest him. Investigators had no substantial evidence against the man. No DNA samples were found on the victim's body, and the court documents did not indicate whether she had been subjected to violence. Detectives questioned Wallace, but he denied any involvement in the crimes. The police themselves wondered how the man could have done all this unnoticed in a small house where his wife and 3 children slept. Without serious evidence or confession, they could not detain Wallace. Therefore, the detectives continued to work on all possible leads. Soon after, an interesting fact emerged. It turned out that Wallace's sister, Candace, worked in the police department that was handling Amanda's case. Moreover, the woman actively helped her brother and his family during the interrogations. She literally told him what to say and how to behave. But that was not all. 5 years ago, she was fired from another police department for falsifying a report on her brother's accident. She wrote that he was driving on a road when a deer ran out in front of him. However, in reality, the man was drunk and had an accident. By that time, other detectives were already handling Amanda's case, and they questioned the objectivity of the investigation by the local police. However, they could not confirm that anyone other than Candace could be helping Wallace. The investigators questioned the man and his family several more times, but all of this did not yield any results. They continued to look for any leads, but in the end, this case stretched on for several years. During this time, the Wallace family complained several times to the police that their home had been vandalized. The fact that the townspeople unanimously believed that the man was a murderer and that he was being covered up by his sister only increased the negative sentiments. The fact that Wallace continued to live among them freely only intensified these feelings. 4 years after the murder, in 2008, detectives turned to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children for help. They sent their investigators to White Cloud, where they reviewed all the case materials, conducted new interrogations, and tried to find new leads. Ultimately, they came to the same conclusion as the local detectives. There was not enough evidence to make an arrest. 3 more years passed, and in 2011, the police finally got a new lead that changed everything. A 27-year-old girl from Texas who grew up in White Cloud went to a news website from her old town. There, she came across information about Amanda's murder and started looking into it. After reading that the victim had spent the night at the Wallace house, the woman decided to go to the police and tell them something disturbing. In 1998, when she still lived in that city and was 13 years old, she stayed overnight at the Wallace house because she was friends with his second foster daughter. In the middle of the night, a man entered their room and assaulted both of them. He then threatened them to keep quiet. The victims were too scared to go to the police, so they never told anyone about what had happened. But after the adult victim learned about Amanda's case, she decided to contact the police. Furthermore, she wrote a statement to the police, which helped investigators to get closer to the arrest of the suspect. They interviewed a large number of White Cloud residents who could potentially have been affected by Wallace's actions, and this tactic worked. They were able to find several women who admitted that the man had touched them inappropriately. All of this happened between 1998 and 2002. The victims were then between 13 and 16 years old. Gathering all this information together, in October 2011, police arrested 43-year-old Wallace. He was charged with molesting these victims, as well as the man who was officially named as a suspect in Amanda's case for the first time. Knowing all that other women had told them, detectives had no doubt about his involvement in the murder. At the preliminary hearing, he was granted bail of $150,000, and somehow he was able to pay this amount. Apparently, his sister and other relatives helped him gather the money. The trial was supposed to begin in a month. While waiting for this, Wallace returned to work. The local residents were unhappy that he had been released on bail. They repeatedly protested outside the company's office, demanding that this man be fired. On November 10th, on the day of the first court hearing, an unexpected turn occurred. Wallace did not show up at the appointed time, and the police immediately declared him wanted. A few hours later, they managed to find his car in the woods near the city. The man was there too. The only thing was that he had taken his own life. Detectives, who did not expect such a turn of events, were forced to continue the investigation. After the suspect's death, they could only rely on significant evidence that could link him to Amanda's death. They obtained a search warrant for his home, trying to find anything related to her murder. The police examined every corner, tore down some walls, and removed floorboards, but they could not find any serious evidence. Afterwards, they shifted their focus to the suspect's sister, Candace. Detectives were certain that she was covering up for her brother and wanted to find out if she knew that he had killed Amanda. After gathering the necessary evidence, Candace was arrested in August 2012. She was charged with intentionally misleading the investigation, but that was only the beginning. During the investigation, detectives found out that Candace had been covering up for her brother during the times when he was dealing in illegal substances. Furthermore, she taught him how to not leave any evidence at the crime scenes. She showed him how to properly wipe his fingerprints off surfaces so that experts couldn't lift them. Candace also advised him to always carry a cigarette with someone else's DNA on it, so that if necessary, he could plant it at the crime scene. Detectives also concluded that at least 9 people knew about Wallace's crimes, but remained silent. All of them were members of his family. The police were unable to prove their guilt. The investigation into Candace's involvement continued for 2 years until 2014, when she made a deal with the police. She admitted to lying to the investigators, and in exchange, 2 other charges were dropped. The issue was that Wallace's sister could not provide consulting services on a case that she was working on as a police officer. Given that she had been helping her brother through interrogations, she broke this rule and was ultimately punished for it. However, Candace continued to insist that her brother was innocent. The court sentenced her to 30 weekends in jail. This is a dubious practice where the convict is only required to be in the jail building for 2 days a week and can freely roam during the rest of the time. Such sentences serve as a kind of half measure, and if a person has committed a minor offense, they can be given several weekends in jail. This way, they receive a punishment, but it does not strongly affect their life. The convicted person can continue to go to work and spend time with their family. Of course, Amanda's relatives were extremely dissatisfied with this decision. They, like the detectives, were sure that Candace had helped her brother avoid punishment. Proving it 100% was not possible. Therefore, she got off with such a minor punishment. The Amanda's family was forced to go through yet another trial. In 2004, medical experts only handed over part of her remains to them so they could hold a funeral. The rest was to be kept by detectives during the investigation, but after Wallace's death, a decision was made to hand over these remains to the relatives. In 2013, the girl's family had to exhume her remains to bury Amanda again. Her mother still hopes that investigators will find any evidence that will prove Wallace's guilt. She also tries to achieve changes in the legislation to change the police approach to searching for missing children. The woman insists that investigators should not conduct an investigation based on their subjective assessments and consider the disappearance as a voluntary escape from home. Thus, there is almost no doubt that Wallace killed Amanda. But what was his motive? Considering that there is no information in the court documents about whether the victim was subjected to violence, 2 assumptions can be made. He probably did assault her but did not leave his biological material, so the investigation decided not to reveal this fact since it was unnecessary. Detectives could also keep this information secret for the sake of the investigation, hoping that the criminal would reveal facts that had never been told. His past crimes also speak in favor of Wallace being the killer. He assaulted at least 3 victims using the same scheme. All of them stayed at his house overnight. The question remains, why did he kill Amanda? Perhaps he planned to intimidate her like the others, but the girl threatened to tell the truth to everyone. Or she tried to run away from him and then he panicked. Something else in this case is very alarming. Detectives suggested that all of Wallace's relatives who were in the house on the night of the murder knew about this crime and even helped the man hide it. In addition to Amanda, his wife, son, and daughter were there. This could explain how he managed to attack the victim without waking any of his relatives. In any case, even without a final verdict from the court, Wallace will no longer be able to harm anyone. The fact that he settled the score with his life before the trial once again speaks in favor of his guilt. even though he took the details of this crime to the grave.